When a billionaire's perfect evening shatters with 5 words on a napkin, she discovers the most expensive things in life aren't bought with money. They're lost through silence. What happens when the woman who built an empire from nothing realizes she's been blind to everything that mattered? Tonight, Eleanor Cross will receive a message that costs nothing but changes everything. A single father working double shifts will risk his livelihood to tell a truth no one else dares to speak. And before dawn breaks over the city skyline, the carefully constructed walls of power, marriage, and control will crack wide open. This is a story about the notes we never write, the truths we're afraid to hear, and the moment when being seen becomes more terrifying than staying invisible. Stay with me until the very end. You won't believe where this journey leads. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see just how far Eleanor's story travels across the world. Now let me take you back to where it all began. One autumn evening when everything looked perfect and nothing actually was. The October rain had stopped just before sunset, leaving the downtown streets glazed with reflected light. Gold from the street lamps, red from the taillights, the deep blue of approaching night. Eleanor Cross stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marchand, the kind of restaurant where reservations were made 3 months in advance, and the silence between courses felt intentional, almost sacred. She watched the city below with the detached appreciation of someone who'd conquered it, studied it, and ultimately grown bored with the view. "Your table is ready, Mrs. Cross." The hostess, young, impeccably groomed, trained to recognize power when it walked through the door, gestured toward the corner booth. Eleanor followed without acknowledgement. Courtesy was something she rationed carefully, spent only where it might yield return. After 23 years of building cross-development from a single property investment into a portfolio worth $3 billion, she'd learned that thank yous were often mistaken for weakness. The booth was her usual spot, secluded enough for privacy, positioned perfectly to survey the room. The leather was the color of burnt caramel, soft and expensive. The table held a single orchid in a crystal vase, white petals with the faintest blush of pink at their hearts, beautiful and entirely without scent. "Will Mr. Cross be joining you this evening?" Eleanor settled into her seat, smoothing the fabric of her charcoal dress. "He's already here, somewhere." The hostess's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the carefully cultivated ignorance of someone paid well to notice nothing. "Of course. Lucas will be your server tonight. He'll be right with you." Eleanor didn't watch her leave. She was already scanning the restaurant, cataloging details with the systematic attention that had made her fortune. Marchand was performing well tonight. Every table filled, the low murmur of conversation punctuated by the gentle clink of silverware against bone china. In the far corner, near the bar, she spotted Richard, her husband of 19 years, leaning against the mahogany counter with the relaxed posture of a man who'd never had to fight for anything. He was laughing at something, his head tilted back, his hand resting casually on the bar top. She felt nothing looking at him. Not anger, not affection, not even the distant fondness of long familiarity. Just a vague sense of furniture slightly out of place, something that belonged in the room but had somehow drifted from its proper position. "Good evening, Mrs. Cross." The voice came from her left, quiet, almost apologetic in its restraint. Eleanor turned to find a man in his mid-30s standing beside her table with a water pitcher and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself small in large spaces. He had dark hair that needed cutting, tired eyes the color of coffee without cream, and the kind of lean build that suggested irregular meals and constant movement. "I'm Lucas. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Eleanor studied him for a moment. There was something unusual about his stillness, not the frozen anxiety of someone intimidated by wealth, but the deliberate quiet of someone conserving energy, spending nothing unnecessarily. His hands were steady as he poured water into her glass. No ring, no watch, a white button-down shirt that had been pressed carefully but showed wear at the collar. "The usual?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You know my usual?" "The 2015 Chateau Margaux. You ordered it last month when you dined here with the mayor." He paused, meeting her gaze briefly before looking away. "You didn't touch your appetizer that night, but you finished your entree. The Dover Sole. Eleanor felt a small spike of interest, the first genuine feeling she'd experienced in hours. You have a good memory. It's part of the job. He pulled out a small notepad, pen poised. Should I bring the wine, or would you prefer to wait for Mr. Cross? Bring it now. He has his own agenda tonight. If Lucas caught the edge in her voice, he gave no indication. He simply nodded and turned toward the kitchen, moving through the crowded restaurant with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much space his body occupied and how to minimize it. Eleanor watched him go, then redirected her attention to the menu she'd already memorized. The ritual of ordering was theater, a performance of consideration and choice when the decision had been made before she'd even left her office. She would have the burrata to start, the sole for her main course, nothing for dessert. She would drink exactly 2 glasses of wine. She would spend 90 minutes here, projecting the image of a woman who could afford leisure, then return to her penthouse and work until 2 in the morning because leisure was actually something she couldn't afford at all. Control. That was the architecture of her life. Every decision calculated, every variable accounted for, every risk assessed and either accepted or eliminated. It was what separated her from Richard, from the other people in this room, from the version of herself who'd grown up in a rented apartment with peeling wallpaper and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Your wine, Mrs. Cross. Lucas reappeared, this time with a bottle and 2 glasses. He performed the tasting ritual with practiced precision, the presentation of the label, the careful uncorking, the small pour for her approval. Eleanor went through the motion, swirling and tasting, nodding her consent. The wine was perfect. It was always perfect here. That was why she kept returning. I'll bring your appetizer shortly. Actually, Eleanor set down her glass. Tell me something. Lucas paused, his expression carefully neutral. Of course. Do you enjoy this work? The question seemed to surprise him. For a moment, the professional mask slipped and she saw something underneath. Exhaustion, perhaps, or a flash of dark humor at the absurdity of a billionaire asking a waiter about job satisfaction. It pays the bills, he said finally, and it's honest work. Honest work. Eleanor repeated the phrase, testing its weight. Is that important to you? Honesty? It's one of the few things that doesn't depreciate over time. Lucas shifted the wine bottle slightly on the table, a small adjustment that suggested discomfort with the conversation's direction. Will there be anything else right now? Eleanor waved him away. She wasn't sure why she'd asked the question, some impulse born from boredom or the particular quality of the evening light, the way it made everything look slightly unfamiliar. She took another sip of wine and returned her attention to the room. Richard had moved from the bar. She spotted him now at a table near the back, partially obscured by a decorative screen of hammered bronze. He wasn't alone. A young woman sat across from him, early 20s, Eleanor guessed, with dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and the kind of luminous skin that came from youth rather than expensive serums. A waitress, based on her uniform. She was leaning forward, saying something that made Richard smile in a way Eleanor couldn't remember seeing in years. Open, unguarded, almost boyish. Eleanor felt a distant curiosity, like noticing an unusual cloud formation. Should she care? The question arrived clinically, without emotional charge. She tried to remember the last time she and Richard had leaned toward each other like that, sharing some private amusement. The attempt produced nothing but blank space. Your burrata, Mrs. Cross? Lucas placed the appetizer before her, fresh mozzarella with heirloom tomatoes, basil, and a drizzle of aged balsamic. The presentation was artful, the tomatoes cut to reveal their internal geometry, the cheese torn rather than sliced to show its texture. Eleanor picked up her fork. Is everything all right? Lucas asked. Why wouldn't it be? No reason, but he hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly toward the back of the restaurant before returning to her. I just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. There was something in his tone, a subtle stress on certain words that suggested layers beneath the surface politeness. Eleanor looked at him more carefully. His expression remained professionally pleasant, but his posture had shifted. The careful invisibility was still there, but underneath it she sensed something else. Tension, the physical language of someone carrying information they weren't sure how to deliver. Is there something you want to tell me? She asked. Lucas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Just that I'll check back in a few minutes. Please enjoy your meal. He left before she could press further. Eleanor watched him retreat toward the kitchen, moving quickly now, urgency replacing the earlier careful pace. Interesting. She returned her attention to the burrata, taking a small bite. The flavors were exactly as they should be. The milky richness of the cheese, the sweet acidity of the tomatoes, the bright punctuation of basil. She ate mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The evening progressed with the same polished choreography. Lucas brought her sole, perfectly cooked, delicate and flaky, served with brown butter and capers. He refilled her wineglass. He appeared and disappeared with the seamless timing of someone who'd mastered the art of anticipating needs without being intrusive. But Eleanor noticed that each time he approached her table, he seemed to be carrying something beyond the physical items on his tray. A weight, a decision unmade. Around her, the restaurant hummed with its particular music. Quiet laughter from a nearby table where an older couple celebrated some private anniversary. The sharp bark of a laugh from a group of young professionals, their suits expensive, their confidence still fresh and untested. The low murmur of a business negotiation happening over steak and red wine. Both parties performing the ritual dance of seeming disinterested while calculating exact percentages. Eleanor had choreographed similar evenings 1,000 times. She'd closed deals over dessert, dismantled competitors over cocktails, built alliances over appetizers. She'd learned to read the room like a ledger, tracking the flow of power and influence, noting who deferred to whom, who paid the check, who walked out first. It was a language she spoke fluently, and until tonight she'd believed she understood every dialect. But something was off. She could feel it the way you feel a missing stair in a familiar staircase, that moment of imbalance before your brain catches up to the error. The restaurant looked the same, the lighting, the flowers, the careful arrangement of tables. The people performed their expected roles. And yet, "Can I clear your plate, Mrs. Cross?" Lucas again. His timing was slightly off now, arriving a moment too early before she'd quite finished. Eleanor set down her fork and studied him. His composure had degraded further. The professional mask remained, but it was cracking at the edges. "Lucas," she kept her voice level. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He reached for her plate, his movements precise but faster than necessary. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction." It was perfect, as always. Eleanor leaned back slightly, creating space for the conversation to expand. "Which is why I'm curious why you seem so uncomfortable." "I'm not." He stopped, plate in hand, and for a moment she saw him make a calculation. Whatever he'd been weighing since the evening began, something was tipping the scale. "Mrs. Cross, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Do you want the truth, or do you want the comfortable lie?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor felt the ripples spreading outward, disturbing the careful surface of the evening. Around them, the restaurant continued its performance, oblivious, unchanged, operating according to scripts everyone had agreed to follow. "I always want the truth," Eleanor said quietly. Lucas nodded, something shifting in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or resignation. "Then I need you to trust me for about 30 seconds. I'm going to bring you your check. When I do, I need you to look underneath it. Can you do that?" Eleanor's pulse kicked up slightly, the first genuine physical response she'd felt all evening. "Why not just tell me now?" "Because I have a daughter who depends on my paycheck." Lucas met her eyes directly for the first time, and she saw real fear there, mixed with something harder. Resolve. "Because I could lose my job for this. Because if I'm going to risk everything I've built, I need to do it the right way. The careful way. The way that gives you information without making me complicit in what happens next." "I don't understand." "You will." He turned away, then paused and looked back. "Mrs. Cross, I really am sorry." He disappeared into the crowd before she could respond. Eleanor sat motionless, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to map the territory of what was about to happen. A problem with the restaurant? Unlikely. Lucas's discomfort seemed personal, directed specifically at her. Something illegal she'd been inadvertently involved in? Possible, but that didn't match the apologetic tone. She looked toward the back of the restaurant. Richard was gone now, his table empty except for wine glasses and the remnants of dessert. The young waitress was nowhere to be seen either. Eleanor felt a cold suspicion beginning to form, crystallizing into something more solid with each passing second. 5 minutes later, Lucas reappeared with a black leather folder. He placed it on the table with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, then stepped back. "Thank you for dining with us this evening, Mrs. Cross." "Lucas," Eleanor kept her voice low, "whatever this is, please, just look." He walked away quickly, not quite running, but moving with clear intent to put distance between himself and whatever was about to detonate. Eleanor watched him go, then turned her attention to the check folder. It looked identical to 1,000 others she'd seen. Black leather, the Marchand logo embossed in gold, the soft weight of good materials. She opened it slowly. The bill itself was unremarkable. The wine, the appetizer, the entree, numbers that meant nothing to someone with her wealth. But tucked beneath the receipt, on a small piece of paper torn from a server's notepad, was a message in careful handwriting. "I'm sorry, but you need to know this tonight. Your husband left 30 minutes ago." He wasn't alone. "The waitress he was with is Melissa Grant. She's 23. This isn't the first time. You deserve to know. You deserve better than finding out some other way. I hope you can forgive me for telling you. Lucas." Eleanor read the words once, twice, 3 times. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing remained even. To anyone watching, she might have been reviewing an itemized charge, checking for errors in the accounting. But inside, something fundamental was shifting, tectonic plates grinding against each other, the slow, inevitable movement that precedes earthquakes. She set down the folder carefully, picked up her wine glass and finished the remaining burgundy liquid in one swallow, placed the glass back on the table with precise gentleness. Then she reached into her purse, extracted her credit card, and tucked it into the folder without looking at the total. The world had not changed around her. The restaurant continued its elegant performance. Piano music drifted from somewhere in the background, something classical and soothing. The couple at the next table was ordering dessert. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles rising like tiny ascending prayers. But Eleanor's perfect evening, the controlled, predictable, entirely manageable evening she'd planned, had cracked open. And standing in the wreckage was the question she'd been avoiding for longer than she wanted to calculate. When had she stopped being seen? When had the woman who missed nothing become completely invisible in her own marriage? She thought about Richard's face when he'd leaned toward the young waitress. Open, unguarded, present, the way he used to look at her back when she was building her company from nothing, and he was the charming lawyer who made her laugh during 18-hour workdays. Back when they talked about everything and nothing, when proximity meant connection rather than just shared real estate. When had that changed? The question arrived without answer, echoing in the space where certainty used to live. Eleanor looked around the restaurant, seeing it differently now. Not as a stage where she performed success, but as a collection of small human dramas. That couple celebrating their anniversary, how many years had they fought to stay present for each other? The business negotiation 3 tables over, how many sacrifices had built those careers? Even the young professionals with their fresh confidence, how many of them would look up one day and realize they'd stopped seeing the people closest to them? Lucas emerged from the kitchen, moving toward her table with obvious reluctance. His professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by naked apprehension. He was a man who'd just thrown a grenade and was waiting to see if he'd survive the explosion. Eleanor signed the receipt without looking at it, adding a tip that was twice the cost of the meal. Then she pulled out a business card, cream-colored, embossed, the cross-development logo in understated gray, and wrote on the back, "Thank you for your honesty. Call me tomorrow, 10 a.m. We should talk." She placed it on top of the folder and stood, gathering her purse. Lucas had reached the table now, his eyes fixed on the folder as if it might detonate. "Mrs. Cross, Read the card." Eleanor's voice was steady, controlled, the same tone she used in boardrooms when negotiating deals worth millions. "And Lucas, you did the right thing. That takes more courage than most people have." She walked out of Marchand with her head high, her pace measured, her expression revealing nothing. To anyone watching, she was simply a wealthy woman concluding an elegant dinner. They couldn't see the tremor starting deep in her chest, the cold spreading through her limbs, the way the ground beneath her feet suddenly felt uncertain. The October night had grown colder during her meal. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, watching her breath form small clouds in the air. Her driver was waiting half a block away. She could see the black town car, the subtle running lights. She could call him over, ride home in silence, return to the penthouse where Richard was probably already sleeping, oblivious or unconcerned about her absence. But she didn't move. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened her calendar. Tomorrow was packed. A meeting with investors at 8, a site inspection at 11, conference calls stacked throughout the afternoon. The architecture of efficiency she'd built, day by day, year by year. The life that looked perfect from the outside and felt increasingly hollow from within. Eleanor thought about the note, the careful handwriting, the apologetic tone, the risk Lucas had taken, knowing he might lose everything by telling her a truth no one else had dared to speak. You deserve better than finding out some other way. Did she? The question arrived with uncomfortable weight. She'd built an empire on ruthless precision, on seeing inefficiency and eliminating it, on treating relationships as strategic alliances rather than emotional investments. She'd prided herself on control, on never being surprised, on always being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And somehow, while she was looking everywhere else, she'd stopped seeing what was right in front of her, or perhaps worse. She'd seen it and simply filed it away as irrelevant data, a problem that didn't affect the bottom line. A young couple walked past, arms linked, laughing about something private and small. Eleanor watched them disappear around the corner, their happiness so casual and unexamined they probably didn't even recognize it as remarkable. When was the last time she'd laughed like that? When was the last time Richard had? The answer was somewhere in the past, buried under years of accumulated indifference. Eleanor finally signaled to her driver. The town car pulled up smoothly, and Martin, 60 years old, unfailingly professional, someone who'd worked for her for a decade and remained a careful stranger, opened the door. "Home, Mrs. Cross?" She hesitated, one foot already in the car. Home. The word felt incorrect somehow, like calling a hotel room home just because you'd stayed there for 19 years. "Yes," she said finally. "Home." She settled into the leather seat as Martin pulled into traffic. Through the tinted windows, the city slid past, the gleaming towers she'd helped build, the construction cranes marking future developments, the streets she knew like a map she'd memorized. Her city, her kingdom, her carefully constructed empire. But tonight, driving through streets she'd conquered, Eleanor Cross felt more lost than she'd been in 23 years. And somewhere in that confusion, beneath the shock and the creeping numbness, a small voice was asking a question she couldn't ignore. What else had she stopped seeing while she was busy looking everywhere else? The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Richard's car was in the garage, the silver Porsche he'd bought 3 years ago and drove maybe twice a month. Eleanor took the private elevator up, her heels clicking against marble that had cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The doors opened onto the foyer, all glass and steel and carefully curated art. Beautiful. Empty. Like walking into a magazine photograph. She found Richard in the den, sprawled on the leather sectional with his laptop balanced on his stomach, tie loosened, shoes off. He looked up when she entered, offering a vague smile that barely registered her presence. "Hey, how was dinner?" Eleanor stood in the doorway, studying him. This man she'd married 19 years ago. This stranger who shared her address but had apparently stopped sharing anything that mattered. She could confront him now. Ask him directly about Melissa Grant, about the waitress he'd left with, about how long the affair had been going on. But looking at him, really looking at him, she realized the affair was just a symptom. The disease had been growing much longer, fed by mutual neglect and the gradual erosion of presence. They'd stopped seeing each other so long ago that infidelity was almost predictable, a logical conclusion to years of emotional distance. "It was fine," she heard herself say. Richard nodded, already returning his attention to his laptop. "Good. I'm just finishing up some emails. Big case next week." Eleanor watched him for another moment, then turned and walked to the bedroom. She changed into silk pajamas that cost $800 and felt like wearing expensive air. She washed her face with products formulated by French chemists. She stood at the window looking out at the city lights, holding a glass of water she didn't want, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt anything real. The note was still in her purse. She took it out, unfolding the small piece of paper, reading Lucas's careful handwriting again. You deserve better than finding out some other way. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Maybe what she deserved was exactly this, the hollow consequence of building an empire while letting her life crumble unnoticed at the foundation. Eleanor climbed into bed alone, the expensive sheets cool and impersonal. Richard would join her eventually, or he wouldn't. It barely mattered anymore. They'd been sleeping in the same bed for years while living in entirely separate worlds. She thought about Lucas, a single father working double shifts at a restaurant, someone who had everything to lose by telling her the truth, someone who'd seen her more clearly in one evening than her own husband had in years. Tomorrow she would call him, they would talk, and maybe, just maybe, she would begin the hard work of learning to see again, starting with the parts of her life she'd been too comfortable ignoring. But tonight, lying in the dark of her expensive bedroom, Eleanor Cross allowed herself something she rarely permitted: uncertainty. The admission that control was an illusion. The recognition that she'd built her entire identity on being invulnerable, and vulnerability had arrived anyway, delivered by a waiter with tired eyes and more courage than she'd shown in years. The note sat on her nightstand, 5 handwritten lines that had cracked her perfect world wide open. She didn't sleep. She simply lay there, watching the city lights paint patterns on her ceiling, and wondered what came next when everything you'd built your life on suddenly revealed itself as hollow. The only sound was Richard's eventual arrival, the soft shuffle of his footsteps, the rustle of sheets, his breathing evening out into sleep, so close and so impossibly far away. Eleanor stared at the darkness and waited for morning. Morning arrived without permission, gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor hadn't slept. Not really. She drifted through those strange hours between midnight and dawn, where time loses meaning, where thoughts circle endlessly without resolution, where the ceiling becomes a screen playing scenes you can't stop watching. Richard's side of the bed was already empty when she finally gave up the pretense of rest. She could hear the shower running in his bathroom. They'd had separate bathrooms for 8 years now, another small concession that had seemed practical at the time and now felt like evidence of something larger. The sound of water through expensive tile was steady, impersonal, the white noise of a life running on autopilot. Eleanor rose and dressed with mechanical precision. A charcoal suit today, perfectly tailored, the armor she wore into boardrooms where showing weakness meant losing millions. She applied makeup with the same systematic attention: foundation, concealer, the subtle enhancement of features that suggested authority without seeming to try. When she looked in the mirror, she saw exactly what she intended: a woman in complete control. The reflection was a liar. She found Richard in the kitchen, already dressed in his own uniform, navy suit, crisp white shirt, the silver cufflinks she'd given him for their 10th anniversary. He was scrolling through his phone while the espresso machine hissed and gurgled, producing the dark liquid that fueled his mornings. He didn't look up when she entered. "Morning," he said, eyes still on the screen. "I've got an early meeting. Probably won't be home until late." Eleanor poured herself coffee from the French press. She preferred the ritual of manual brewing, the small act of intention Richard had always found unnecessarily complicated. "We need to talk." "Can it wait? I'm running behind." "No." She kept her voice level. "It can't." Something in her tone made him look up finally, his expression shifting from distracted to mildly concerned. "What's wrong?" Eleanor took a sip of coffee, buying herself a moment. The note was still in her purse upstairs, but she didn't need to read it again. The words were carved into her memory now, permanent as scars. "Where were you last night? After dinner?" Richard's face remained neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the micro-expression of someone calculating their next move. "I had drinks with a client." "Why?" "Which client?" "Eleanor, what is this?" He set down his phone with deliberate care. "Why are you interrogating me?" "I'm asking a simple question." "Which client?" Davidson, from the Henderson case. The lie arrived smoothly, practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd deployed it. We met at the bar around 9, talked strategy for a couple hours. I got home around 11:30. You were already asleep. Eleanor nodded slowly, watching him. 23 years of reading people in high-stakes negotiations had taught her the grammar of deception, the slight pause before answering, the extra detail designed to sound convincing, the way liars often over-explain simple things. "That's interesting," she said quietly, "because I was at Marchand last night. I saw you there." Richard went very still. The expensive kitchen hummed around them, the refrigerator, the espresso machine winding down, the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy and unavoidable. "You were there?" His voice was careful now, recalibrating. "I was. And I saw you with someone, a young woman. You left together around 8:30. She watched him process this, watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. He could deny it, claim she was mistaken, that she'd misinterpreted what she'd seen. But they both knew she hadn't gotten where she was by misreading situations. "Eleanor, don't." She set down her coffee cup with precise gentleness. "I'm not interested in explanations right now. I need you to answer one question honestly. Can you do that?" Richard leaned against the counter, his posture shifting from defensive to something more tired. Resigned, maybe, or relieved that pretense was no longer required. "Go ahead." "How long?" "Does it matter?" "Answer the question, Richard." He looked away, studying the marble countertop as if it held some answer he'd been searching for. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. 6 months. Maybe 7. Eleanor felt the words land like physical blows, each one precise and devastating. She'd known. The note had told her, her own observations had confirmed it, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that bypassed all her careful defenses. 6 months, she repeated. "You've been sleeping with a 23-year-old waitress for half a year. Her age doesn't matter." "Doesn't it?" Eleanor felt something cold rising in her chest. Not quite anger, but something sharper. "A woman young enough to be your daughter. Someone who probably makes minimum wage plus tips while you pull down $500,000 a year. You don't think there's a power imbalance there? You don't think that matters?" "Jesus, Eleanor." Richard's composure cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through. "You want to make this about ethics? About fairness? Where was your concern about power dynamics when you fired 300 people last year to boost quarterly profits?" "That's business." "And this is what exactly? A moral failing? A betrayal of sacred vows?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When was the last time we actually talked? When was the last time you looked at me like I was something other than a line item in your perfect life?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, because he wasn't entirely wrong. She tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had, something beyond logistics and schedules, beyond the transactional exchange of information that passed for communication. The attempt produced nothing but empty space. "That doesn't justify infidelity," she said finally. "No, it doesn't." Richard picked up his coffee cup, took a long swallow, set it down again. "I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just trying to explain why a life that looks perfect from the outside can feel completely hollow from within." The words hung between them, too honest to ignore. Eleanor felt something shifting in her chest. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but a reluctant recognition that the failure here was more complex than simple betrayal. They'd built this together, brick by brick, compromise by compromise. The house of their marriage had been beautiful from the outside, but neither of them had noticed when it became uninhabitable. "So what now?" she asked. "I don't know." Richard met her eyes, and for the first time in years she saw something genuine there. Sadness, maybe, or the exhausted relief of someone who'd been holding their breath for too long. "What do you want?" Eleanor considered the question. What did she want? A divorce seemed obvious, clean, efficient, the logical conclusion to a failed partnership. But standing in her perfect kitchen with her unfaithful husband, she realized the betrayal that hurt most wasn't his affair. It was the slow erosion of presence they'd both allowed, the mutual decision to stop really seeing each other. "I want the truth," she said. "All of it. Who is she?" "Her name is Melissa. She works at Marchand. She's—" Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's kind. Funny. She actually listens when I talk. And I don't? Do you?" The question arrived without malice, just exhausted honesty. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about calendars or bank accounts or the next acquisition you're planning?" Eleanor felt the accusation settle over her like cold water. She wanted to deny it, to defend herself, to point out all the ways she'd maintained their life, the penthouse, the cars, the lifestyle he enjoyed without question. But the defense felt hollow even before she spoke it. "I built this life for us," she said quietly. "I know, and I'm grateful for that. But Eleanor, you built an empire and forgot to leave room for anything else, including me." The words hurt because they were true. She'd spent 23 years focused on growth, on expansion, on the next deal and the next property, and the next million added to her net worth. She'd told herself it was all for them, for their future, for security. But somewhere in that relentless forward motion, she'd stopped asking what they were building toward. She'd stopped asking if Richard was even still beside her on the journey. "I should go," Richard said, checking his watch with the automatic gesture of someone always measuring time. "My meeting starts in 20 minutes. "Wait." Eleanor moved toward him, then stopped, unsure what she was trying to reach for. "We need to finish this conversation." "Do we?" "I think we both know where it's heading." "Richard." "Eleanor, I love you. I do." His voice was gentle now, almost kind. "But I don't think I've been in love with you for a very long time. And I don't think you've been in love with me either. We've just been too busy to notice." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the hallway, the elevator chiming, the sound of the doors closing with quiet finality. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by marble and stainless steel and all the expensive trappings of success, and felt the carefully constructed walls of her life beginning to crumble. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. "Investors meeting in 40 mins. Should I have Martin bring the car around?" Eleanor stared at the message, at the routine demanding her attention, pulling her back into the familiar rhythms of work and control. She could do this. She could put on her armor, walk into that meeting, negotiate and strategize and close deals worth millions. She could perform competence so convincingly that no one would guess her marriage was disintegrating in real time. But instead, she typed back, "Cancel it. Reschedule for tomorrow." The response came immediately. "Everything okay?" Eleanor didn't answer. She poured more coffee, carried it to the living room, and sank into the sectional where Richard had been sitting last night, pretending to work while his affair continued wherever he'd gone. The morning light was stronger now, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every surface with cruel clarity. She thought about Lucas, the waiter who'd risked everything to tell her the truth. She'd told him to call at 10, but it was barely 8 now. 2 hours to sit with the wreckage of her marriage, 2 hours to decide what came next. Her phone buzzed again. Not her assistant this time, but an unknown number. She answered without thinking. "Mrs. Cross, it's Lucas Reed from Marchand." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Surprise, perhaps, or the strange relief of hearing a voice that held no history, no accumulated disappointment. "You're early. I said 10. "I know. I'm sorry. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what I'd done, whether I'd made everything worse." He paused, and she could hear the anxiety in his breathing. "Did you confront him?" "This morning, yes." "And?" Eleanor looked around her living room, the art she'd collected but never really looked at, the furniture chosen by an interior designer for aesthetic impact rather than comfort, the windows that offered a view of a city she'd conquered but never really inhabited. "And you were right. About everything." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You did what no one else had the courage to do." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "Can we meet? I know I said 10, but if you're available now—" "I can't right now. I have my daughter this morning. but I could meet you around noon. There's a coffee shop near my apartment. Nothing fancy, but it's quiet. Send me the address. He did, and 20 minutes later, Eleanor was in her car, driving herself for the first time in months. Martin had looked confused when she'd waved him off, insisting she wanted to drive. But she needed this, the physical act of steering, the small decisions about lanes and turns, the sensation of being in control of something, even if it was just a vehicle moving through traffic. The coffee shop was in a neighborhood Eleanor rarely visited, working class, diverse, the kind of place where people lived actual lives rather than just storing their possessions between business trips. She found parking on the street, fed quarters into a meter with the hands that had forgotten how to perform such mundane tasks, and pushed through the door. Lucas was already there, sitting at a corner table with a mug of something steaming. He looked different in daylight, without the formal uniform and professional mask. Jeans and a faded blue Henley, his hair slightly mussed, the exhaustion more visible without restaurant lighting to soften it. A small girl sat beside him, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark curls and serious eyes, working on a coloring book with intense concentration. He stood when Eleanor approached, his posture uncertain. Mrs. Cross, thank you for coming. Call me Eleanor, please. She looked at the child, who was watching her with open curiosity. And who's this? This is my daughter, Sophie. Say hello, sweetheart. Hello. Sophie's voice was soft but clear. Are you my dad's friend? Eleanor felt something catch in her throat. The simple directness of the question, the assumption that adults who met for coffee must be friends. I suppose I might be. Is that okay with you? Sophie considered this seriously, then nodded. Okay, but don't talk too loud. I'm coloring. I'll be very quiet. Lucas gestured to the chair across from him. Can I get you something? The coffee here is actually decent. Just black coffee. Thank you. He disappeared toward the counter, leaving Eleanor alone with Sophie. The girl had returned to her coloring book, an elaborate page of butterflies and flowers that she was filling in with meticulous attention to staying inside the lines. Eleanor watched her work, fascinated by the concentration, the small tongue poking out slightly as Sophie chose between 2 shades of purple. You're very good at that, Eleanor said. I practice. Sophie didn't look up. My dad says if you practice something enough, you get better, so I practice coloring every day. That's very wise advice. He's good at advice. Now Sophie did look up, fixing Eleanor with those serious eyes. Are you sad? The question arrived like an arrow, unexpected and precise. Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure waver. Why do you ask? You look like my dad does sometimes, when he thinks I'm not watching, like you're trying really hard not to cry. Eleanor blinked, feeling the dangerous pressure behind her eyes. This child, this small, observant, ridiculously perceptive child, had seen through her in 30 seconds. I suppose I am a little sad today. Did something bad happen? Something complicated happened. Sometimes grown-up problems are hard to explain. Sophie nodded sagely. My dad says that too, but I think grown-ups make things too complicated. Usually the answer is pretty simple if you just say what's true. You're a very smart girl. I know. Sophie returned to her coloring. My dad tells me that all the time. Lucas returned with Eleanor's coffee, plus a small hot chocolate for Sophie. He slid into his seat, glancing between them. You two getting acquainted? Sophie was just teaching me about the value of practice, Eleanor said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, and about telling the truth. Lucas smiled, a real smile, unguarded and genuine. She's better at both than I am. They sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop humming with quiet morning activity around them. A student typing on a laptop in the corner, an older couple sharing a pastry, the barista wiping down the espresso machine with methodical care, normal life continuing its mundane rhythms while Eleanor's world restructured itself. I talked to him, she said finally. My husband. This morning. Lucas's expression grew serious. How did he react? He admitted it. 6 or 7 months, apparently, with Melissa Grant, like you said. Eleanor took a sip of coffee. It was decent, strong, and honest. Nothing like the artisanal blends she usually drank. But the affair isn't really the problem. Or maybe it is. But it's not the whole problem. What do you mean? Eleanor struggled to find the words. She'd spent her entire career communicating with precision, but this required a different language, one she'd neglected for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. He said something that I can't stop thinking about. He said I built an empire and forgot to leave room for anything else, including him. Lucas was quiet, his hands wrapped around his own mug. Sophie had put down her crayons and was listening now, not even pretending to color anymore. Is that true? Lucas asked gently. I don't know. Maybe. Eleanor set down her coffee, needing something to do with her hands. I thought I was building a life, security, success, all the things I never had growing up. But somewhere in all that building, I stopped paying attention to what I was building it for. My mom was like that, Sophie said suddenly. Both adults turned to look at her. She was staring at her coloring book, not meeting their eyes. She worked all the time, and then one day she just left. Lucas reached over and squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. Sophie, it's okay, Dad. I know you don't like talking about it, but it's true. Sophie looked up at Eleanor now, her expression open and achingly honest. My dad says Mom had her reasons, that sometimes people need different things to be happy, but I think maybe she just forgot how to be happy with what she had. The wisdom in those words, coming from a child who couldn't be more than 8, hit Eleanor like a physical force. This little girl, abandoned by her mother, sitting in a cheap coffee shop with her single father waiter while he tried to help a stranger navigate her own marriage. The contrast to Eleanor's life was so stark it was almost absurd. I'm sorry that happened to you, Eleanor said quietly. Sophie shrugged, a gesture too adult for her small frame. It's okay. I have my dad, and he's always here. Lucas's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. He cleared his throat, looking away briefly before meeting Eleanor's gaze again. I didn't bring her to make you feel guilty. I didn't have childcare this morning, and I wanted to meet you like you asked. I'm glad you brought her. Eleanor meant it. Something about Sophie's presence made this conversation feel more real, less like theater. She's remarkable. She is. Lucas smiled at his daughter with such uncomplicated love that Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. She's the only thing I ever did completely right. Why did you tell me? Eleanor asked abruptly. Last night. Why risk your job? Lucas considered the question, his fingers tracing patterns on the side of his mug. Because I've seen you there before, at Marchand. Always alone, always working through dinner on your laptop or your phone. And I've seen the way your husband treats the staff, the way he treats everyone, actually. Like we're not quite real, like we're just background scenery in his life. That bothered you? It did. But what really bothered me was watching you sit there, completely unaware that he was 20 feet away with someone else. You deserve to know, not because I'm some moral crusader, but because... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. Because invisibility is a kind of cruelty, and I know what it feels like to be invisible. Eleanor thought about his careful observation last night, the way he'd cataloged her preferences, remembered her order from a month prior, noticed details that everyone else overlooked. He'd made himself invisible as a survival strategy, but in doing so, he'd learned to really see other people, while she'd spent years demanding to be seen, to be recognized, to have her presence acknowledged, and in the process, she'd stopped seeing anyone else. What do I do now? The question escaped before she could stop it, vulnerable and unguarded. Lucas shook his head slowly. I can't answer that. I can barely manage my own life. But I can tell you what I learned when my wife left. You can spend forever analyzing what went wrong, trying to assign blame, constructing elaborate narratives about who failed whom. Or you can just be honest about what you actually want now, moving forward. And what if I don't know what I want? Then that's your starting point, not knowing. He glanced at Sophie, who'd returned to her coloring. After Sarah left, I spent 6 months trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I could have been different, whether I was enough. And then one night, Sophie asked me why I was always sad. And I realized I was so busy looking backward that I'd stopped being present for the one person who actually needed me. Eleanor watched him with his daughter, saw the easy affection between them, the trust. This man who worked double shifts at a restaurant, who probably worried about rent and childcare and all the mundane concerns she'd insulated herself from with wealth. He had less than her in every measurable way. But watching him now, she understood he had something she'd lost or perhaps never had, the ability to be fully present, to show up completely for someone else. "Your ex-wife," Eleanor said carefully. "She just left? No warning?" "Oh, there was warning. I just didn't want to see it." Lucas's smile was rueful. Sarah was ambitious, driven. She had big dreams about the life she wanted, and somewhere along the way I became an obstacle to those dreams instead of a partner in them. So she left, took a job in London, sends Sophie birthday cards twice a year and never calls. That must be incredibly hard. It was. It is. He looked at his daughter with obvious love. But it also clarified things. I know exactly what matters now. I know who shows up. I know what presence actually means. Eleanor felt tears threatening again. This strange emotional leakage that kept catching her by surprise. She'd spent decades controlling her reactions, managing her expressions, presenting exactly the image she wanted to project. But sitting in this coffee shop with a waiter and his 8-year-old daughter, her careful defenses were crumbling. "I fired someone once," she heard herself say. 3 years ago. A young woman named Maya Collins. She'd been with my company for 6 months, an intern, straight out of college, so eager to prove herself. Lucas waited, not interrupting. She made a mistake on a presentation. Nothing catastrophic, but it was embarrassing, made me look unprepared in front of investors. Eleanor stared at her coffee, watching the dark surface ripple slightly. I fired her on the spot. Didn't give her a chance to explain, didn't consider that she was learning, that everyone makes mistakes. I just eliminated the problem. Why are you telling me this? Because last night when I saw Melissa Grant with my husband? Eleanor looked up, meeting Lucas's eyes. I recognized her. It took me a few hours to place it, but I finally did. Melissa Grant is Maya Collins. She changed her name, but it's the same person. The intern I fired without mercy, the career I probably destroyed. Lucas's expression shifted. Surprise, then something more complex. Understanding, maybe, or the recognition of patterns too large to be coincidence. "So your husband's affair," he said slowly, "is with someone you fired." "Yes, and I don't know if that matters, if it's relevant, if it changes anything, but it feels like—" Eleanor struggled for the words. "Like the universe putting a mirror in front of me, showing me the consequences of my actions. Or maybe I'm just trying to find meaning where there isn't any. Or maybe," Sophie said, not looking up from her coloring, "you need to say sorry." Both adults turned to stare at her. She continued working on her butterfly, adding careful strokes of orange to its wings. "When I do something mean," Sophie continued matter-of-factly, "my dad makes me apologize, even if I didn't mean to be mean, even if I had a reason. Because saying sorry isn't about who's right. It's about acknowledging when you've hurt someone." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some defensive wall she'd been maintaining without even realizing it. This child was right. Sophie was absolutely, devastatingly right. She'd spent her entire career believing that apologies were weakness, that admitting fault meant losing power. But sitting here now, she understood that refusal to apologize was its own kind of prison. "You have a very wise daughter," Eleanor said to Lucas. "I know." His voice was thick with emotion. "She's better than I deserve." "You deserve her completely." Eleanor stood abruptly, needing movement, needing air. "I should go. I've taken enough of your morning." "Eleanor, Mrs. Cross." "Wait." Lucas rose too. "I hope I didn't make things worse. I just wanted you to know the truth." "You didn't make anything worse. You just helped me see what was already broken." Eleanor pulled out her wallet, extracted a business card. "This has my direct number. If you ever need anything, a reference, a new job, help with childcare costs, please call me. I mean that." Lucas took the card, handling it like it might detonate. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you honesty and gratitude. You had the courage to risk everything to tell me the truth. That's worth more than you know." She turned to leave, then paused. Sophie was watching her with those serious, knowing eyes. "Sophie, thank you for your wisdom today. I needed to hear it. You're welcome. Sophie smiled, the first real smile Eleanor had seen from her. I hope the sad goes away soon. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Eleanor walked out of the coffee shop into bright October sunlight that felt too cheerful for her mood. Her hands were shaking slightly as she unlocked her car. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, not starting the engine, just breathing. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. Her assistant. Her CFO. 2 investors. Her lawyer. The machinery of her empire demanding attention, demanding she return to her role, demanding she perform the version of herself everyone expected. But Eleanor didn't start the car. Instead, she pulled up her contacts, scrolling until she found a name she hadn't called in 3 years. Maya Collins. She'd kept the number. She kept everyone's numbers, filed away in case they might someday be useful. The most cynical kind of networking. Her finger hovered over the call button. What would she even say? How do you apologize for derailing someone's career? How do you acknowledge that your ruthless efficiency had real costs, affected real lives? Sophie's voice echoed in her head. Saying sorry isn't about who's right. It's about acknowledging when you've hurt someone. Eleanor pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a familiar voice, younger than she remembered, uncertain. Hello? Maya, this is Eleanor Cross. I need to talk to you, and I need to apologize. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long Eleanor thought Maya might have hung up. She sat in her car outside the coffee shop, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the sound of breathing that suggested shock, confusion, maybe anger. Mrs. Cross? Maya's voice finally came, carefully controlled. I'm sorry. I think I misheard you. Did you say you wanted to apologize? I did, and I do. Eleanor watched a young mother push a stroller past her car, the ordinary rhythm of other people's lives continuing while hers fractured. I know this is unexpected. I know I have no right to call you after 3 years, but I need to talk to you, in person, if you're willing. Why now? The question was sharp, direct. You destroyed my career 3 years ago without a second thought. You didn't just fire me. You made sure I couldn't get another job in the industry. You blacklisted me, Mrs. Cross. So forgive me if I'm a little confused about this sudden attack of conscience. Eleanor closed her eyes, the words landing like deserved blows. She'd forgotten about that, the calls she'd made to her network, the casual mentions that Maya Collins was unreliable, not ready for professional work. She'd thought she was protecting her reputation. She'd actually been destroying someone else's future. You're right, Eleanor said quietly. Everything you just said is true, and I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make it right, or at least acknowledge the damage I caused. Please, Maya, one conversation, anywhere you want, any time that works for you. Another long silence. Eleanor could hear voices in the background, restaurant noise, the clatter of dishes, someone calling out orders. Maya was at work, probably. At Marchand, where she'd rebuilt her life after Eleanor had demolished it. I get off at 3, Maya said finally. There's a park 2 blocks from the restaurant, Riverside Park near the fountain. I'll give you 30 minutes, that's all? Thank you. I'll be there. The line went dead. Eleanor sat holding her phone, feeling the weight of the conversation ahead. She'd faced hostile boardrooms, aggressive negotiators, investors looking for any weakness to exploit. But somehow, this felt more daunting. This wasn't about money or power or strategic advantage. This was about looking directly at the consequences of her own cruelty. She checked her watch. 4.5 hours until the meeting. Time she should spend at the office, managing the 17 crises her missed calls probably represented. Instead, she texted her assistant. Taking the day. Handle what you can. Defer the rest. I'll explain tomorrow. The response came immediately. Are you okay? Eleanor stared at the question. Was she okay? Her marriage was ending. She'd just discovered her husband's affair was with someone she'd wronged years ago. She'd spent the morning drinking coffee with a waiter and his daughter, learning lessons about presence from an 8-year-old. Nothing about this was okay. Everything about this felt like watching her carefully constructed life collapse in slow motion. I will be, she typed back. Eventually. She started the car and drove aimlessly, not ready to return to the penthouse that suddenly felt like a museum of her own emptiness. The city flowed past her windows, the downtown skyscrapers giving way to residential neighborhoods, tree-lined streets where people lived in houses instead of vertical glass towers. She thought about Lucas and Sophie, their small apartment somewhere in this sprawl, their modest life that somehow contained more genuine connection than her entire existence. Eleanor found herself driving past her old neighborhood, the place she'd grown up before wealth had insulated her from ordinary struggle. The apartment building was still there, more run down than she remembered, its beige paint peeling in patches. She pulled over across the street and sat staring at the third-floor window where she'd spent her childhood. She remembered being 12 years old, watching her mother come home from her third job of the day, exhaustion carved into every line of her face. Her mother had cleaned office buildings at night, worked retail during the day, and took in sewing on weekends, all to keep them in that cramped apartment, to keep Eleanor in decent clothes, to save money for a college fund that grew with painful slowness. "I'm going to be different," Eleanor had told her mother one night, watching her hand stitch a hem by lamplight. "I'm going to make so much money you'll never have to work again." Her mother had looked up with tired eyes and a sad smile. "Baby, money isn't everything. Don't forget that when you're chasing it." But Eleanor had forgotten. Or maybe she'd never really believed it. She'd spent 23 years proving that money was everything, that it bought security, respect, power, insulation from the struggles that had worn her mother down. She'd built an empire to prove that financial success was the ultimate validation. And now, sitting in her luxury car outside her childhood poverty, Eleanor realized her mother had been trying to warn her. Not that wealth was bad, but that the pursuit of it could consume everything else if you weren't careful, that you could win the game and lose yourself in the process. Her phone buzzed. "Richard, I'm moving out. I'll get my things this weekend. My lawyer will be in touch." Eleanor read the message 3 times, waiting for some emotional response. Sadness, anger, relief. But nothing came, just a hollow acknowledgement that the marriage was ending, had probably ended years ago, and they'd both been too proud or too cowardly to admit it. She typed back, "Okay, I'll make sure I'm not there. Take whatever you want." His response was almost immediate. "I don't want anything, just my clothes and some books. You can keep the rest." Eleanor laughed, a sharp, humorless sound in the empty car. They'd accumulated 19 years of possessions together, and he wanted none of it. Because none of it actually mattered. They'd filled their home with expensive things to disguise the fact that they'd stopped filling it with love, connection, presence. The stuff was just set dressing for a play neither of them wanted to perform anymore. She drove to Riverside Park early, needing time to prepare herself for the confrontation ahead. The park was beautiful in the afternoon light, old trees dropping gold and crimson leaves, the fountain sending up plumes of water that caught the sun, creating small rainbows. She found a bench near the fountain and sat watching families, joggers, an elderly man feeding pigeons with careful, economical gestures. "Mrs. Cross!" Eleanor turned to find Maya standing behind her. 3 years had changed her. She looked older, harder. The eager brightness Eleanor remembered replaced by something more guarded. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Without the marchand uniform, she looked like what she was, a young woman trying to survive in a city that chewed up people without connections. "Maya, thank you for coming." Eleanor gestured to the bench. "Please, sit." Maya remained standing, arms crossed. "I prefer to stand. You said 30 minutes. The clock's running." Eleanor nodded, accepting the hostility. She deserved it. "I owe you an apology, a real one, not some corporate statement designed to protect myself. I was cruel to you 3 years ago. I fired you for a minor mistake, and then I made sure you couldn't find work anywhere else in the industry. I did that because you embarrassed me in front of investors, and I couldn't tolerate that. I sacrificed your career to protect my ego." Maya's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor saw her jaw tighten. "Go on." "I told myself I was maintaining standards, that I was running a business that couldn't afford mistakes. But the truth is, I was just being vindictive. You were 22 years old, 6 months out of college, and I treated you like you were disposable." Eleanor forced herself to maintain eye contact, to not look away from the pain she'd caused. "There's no excuse for what I did. I can't undo it. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did to you, and I'm sorry." Maya was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fountain. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. "Do you know what happened after you fired me?" "No." "I couldn't find work. Not in real estate, not in development, not anywhere adjacent to the industry. Your reputation preceded me everywhere I went." Maya's hands clenched at her sides. "I burned through my savings in 3 months. Had to move back in with my parents. My dad had just been diagnosed with cancer, stage 3 colon cancer, and instead of helping with medical bills, I was a burden again. 22 years old and living in my childhood bedroom while my father was dying." Eleanor felt something cold spreading through her chest. She'd known she'd hurt Maya's career, but she hadn't considered the cascading consequences. The way professional destruction rippled into every other part of someone's life. "I started waiting tables," Maya continued, "because it was the only work I could get. And you know what the worst part was? I was good at real estate. I loved it. I loved the problem solving, the negotiations, the way you could see your work actually change the skyline, but you took that from me. You took my future because I made one mistake." "I know." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'm sorry." "You're sorry." Maya laughed, sharp and bitter. "You're sorry now, 3 years later, after you've had your perfect life while I've been scraping by on minimum wage and tips. Why now, Mrs. Cross? What changed?" Eleanor took a breath, deciding honesty was the only currency that mattered anymore. "I found out my husband was having an affair, and the woman he was with, it was you. Melissa Grant. You changed your name." Maya's composure cracked. Color flooded her face, her arms dropping to her sides. How did you? "A waiter at Marchand told me. He saw you together. He told me because he thought I deserved to know." Eleanor kept her voice level, fighting the urge to look away. "And when I realized who you were, I understood something. The affair wasn't random. The universe didn't just happen to put you and Richard together. My cruelty 3 years ago set events in motion that led to this moment. I destroyed your career. You ended up at Marchand. You met my husband. And now, here we are." Maya sat down on the bench suddenly, as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She stared at her hands, her breathing uneven. "I didn't know. When I met Richard, I didn't know he was your husband. Not at first. But you figured it out eventually." "Yes." Maya looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "About 3 months in. He mentioned your name, talked about you like you were this distant figure in his life. And I realized the woman who destroyed my career was the woman he came home to every night. And you know what I felt? I felt glad. Glad that I could hurt you the way you hurt me." The honesty was brutal, devastating. Eleanor felt it like a physical blow. But she also felt something else, a strange respect for Maya's willingness to admit the vindictive satisfaction. At least it was honest. At least it was real. "Did you love him?" Eleanor asked. "Or was it always about revenge?" Maya was quiet for a long time, watching the fountain. "I don't know. Maybe both. Maybe neither. He was kind to me. He listened. He made me feel like I mattered. And yes, there was something satisfying about being chosen by the husband of the woman who'd made me feel worthless, but..." She stopped, struggling with the words. "But it also felt hollow, like I was trying to fill a hole in myself with someone else's life." "That's very honest." "Honesty is about all I have left." Maya wiped her eyes roughly. "So now what? You've apologized. You've acknowledged what you did. Do you want me to quit? Promise to never see Richard again? What's the price of your forgiveness?" "I don't want anything from you," Eleanor said. "I just wanted you to know that I see what I did. And I want to make it right, if that's even possible." "How? You can't give me back 3 years. You can't resurrect my father. He died 18 months ago, by the way. You can't restore my reputation in an industry I'll never work in again." Eleanor felt the words like stones, each one heavy with earned resentment. Maya was right. There was no fixing this, no transaction that could balance the scales. But maybe there was something else she could offer. "What if you could work in real estate again?" Eleanor asked carefully. "What if I helped rebuild what I destroyed?" Maya's laugh was harsh. "You think I'd work for you after everything?" "Not for me. For yourself. Eleanor pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. I know people across the industry, good people who owe me favors. I can make calls. I can open doors. I can give you back the career I took from you. And what would you get out of that? A clean conscience? No. My conscience will never be clean, but maybe I could help you get back something I stole. Eleanor met Maya's eyes. You said you loved real estate, that you were good at it. Let me help you prove that to the world. Maya stared at her, something shifting in her expression. Suspicion warred with hope. Resentment fought against the desperate desire to believe. Why would you do this? Because I spent 23 years believing that success meant crushing anyone in my way. Because I built an empire on the assumption that efficiency mattered more than humanity. Because Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. Because a single father and his 8-year-old daughter taught me this morning that apologies mean acknowledging when you've hurt someone. And I hurt you, Maya. I hurt you badly. And I need to try to make it right. Maya was crying now, not bothering to hide it. I don't know if I can forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to help repair what I broke. They sat in silence, the fountain splashing behind them, the autumn sun warm on their faces. Around them, life continued. Joggers passing, children laughing, dogs pulling their owners toward interesting smells. The ordinary miracle of a Tuesday afternoon in the city. Okay, Maya said finally, her voice small. Okay, I'll let you help, but not because I forgive you, because I deserve a second chance, because I've spent 3 years in limbo and I'm tired of being stuck. That's fair. Eleanor pulled out a business card, wrote several numbers on the back. These are direct lines to 3 executives I trust. Tell them I sent you. Tell them you're talented and I made a mistake 3 years ago. They'll listen. Maya took the card, holding it like it might disappear. What about Richard? What about us? That's between you and between him and me. But Maya, whatever happens with my marriage, you deserve better than being someone's revenge or someone's escape. You deserve to be chosen for yourself, not because of what choosing you means to someone else. Maya nodded, fresh tears spilling over. I'm sorry. About the affair. About all of it. I know, and I'm sorry too for everything I put you through. They sat together on the bench, 2 women connected by damage, trying to figure out how to move forward when the past couldn't be undone. Eleanor thought about the confrontation she'd been avoiding, the inevitable conversation with Richard about why his affair had landed where it did. But that could wait. Right now, this mattered more. Can I ask you something? Maya said after a while. How did you become the way you are, so focused on success that you forgot about people? Eleanor considered the question, reaching back through the years. I grew up poor, really poor. I watched my mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep us afloat, and I decided I would never be that vulnerable again. I would never depend on anyone. I would build something so secure that nothing could shake it. But it didn't work, did it? You built an empire and you're still vulnerable, just to different things. You're right. I traded one kind of vulnerability for another. I thought if I controlled everything, I'd be safe. But control is an illusion, and isolation is just another kind of poverty. Maya stood, tucking the business card into her pocket. I should go. I have another shift tonight. Eleanor stood too. Thank you for listening, for giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet. I might still decide you're not worth forgiving. But Maya's voice had lost some of its sharp edge. Mrs. Cross? That waiter who told you about me and Richard? What's his name? Lucas Reed. Why? Because he risked his job to tell you the truth. That takes real courage. Maya met Eleanor's eyes. Maybe hang on to people like that. The ones who tell you hard truths even when it costs them something. She walked away, disappearing into the flow of people moving through the park. Eleanor watched her go, feeling exhausted and oddly lighter. The conversation hadn't fixed anything, hadn't erased the damage, hadn't restored what had been lost. But it was a start, an acknowledgement, a small step toward something that might eventually look like repair. Her phone buzzed. Richard again. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the house? Eleanor stared at the message, the confrontation she'd been avoiding. The conversation about how they'd arrived at this moment, about the affair and the emptiness and the slow death of their marriage. She could put it off, delay it, buy herself time to prepare. But Sophie's voice echoed in her head. Usually the answer is pretty simple if you just say what's true. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she typed back. The drive home felt surreal, like traveling through a city she'd lived in for years but was seeing for the first time. The buildings looked different, the light hit the streets at angles that seemed unfamiliar. Or maybe she was different, and the city was just finally showing her what had always been there. The penthouse was quiet when she arrived. Richard was in the living room, standing by the windows with a whiskey in his hand, expensive single malt they kept for important guests. He turned when she entered, and she was struck by how tired he looked. Not just physically exhausted, but worn down by something deeper. The same exhaustion she saw in her own mirror. "Thanks for coming," he said. Eleanor set down her purse, maintaining physical distance. "You said we needed to talk." "I spoke with Maya. She called me. She told me about your conversation." Richard took a long swallow of whiskey. "She told me who she really is, what you did to her 3 years ago." "I see. Why didn't you tell me? This morning when we talked about the affair, why didn't you mention that you knew her, that you destroyed her career?" Eleanor moved to the bar, poured herself a matching whiskey. "Because it didn't seem relevant to the larger problem. Yes, you had an affair with someone I wronged, but the affair is a symptom, Richard, not the disease." "What's the disease then? According to you?" "We stopped seeing each other. We stopped being present. We built this perfect life, this beautiful, expensive, impressive life, and forgot to actually live in it together." Eleanor took a sip, the whiskey burning pleasantly. "You said this morning that I built an empire and forgot to leave room for anything else. You were right, I did that, but you enabled it, you benefited from it, and you never once asked me to stop." Richard's jaw tightened. "So this is my fault? The affair is my fault because I didn't complain loudly enough about your work schedule?" "No, the affair is your fault because you had it. But the hollow marriage, that's both our faults. We both stopped trying. We both settled for the appearance of partnership without the substance of it." "Jesus, Eleanor." Richard set down his glass with more force than necessary. "You want to talk about not trying? You want to talk about being present? When was the last time we had sex? When was the last time you touched me without it being some obligatory gesture? When was the last time you looked at me like I was something other than a piece of furniture?" The words landed with brutal accuracy. Eleanor felt them hit, felt the truth in them. She tried to remember the last time they'd been intimate, really intimate, not just going through motions. The answer was somewhere in the distant past, buried under years of accumulated indifference. "You're right," she said quietly. "I stopped seeing you as a person. I treated you like an accessory to my life. And that was cruel." Richard blinked, clearly surprised by the admission. "You're just agreeing with me?" "Yes, because it's true. And I'm tired of defending myself. I'm tired of pretending that being right matters more than being honest." They stood in silence, the city humming 20 floors below. Eleanor thought about all the conversations they hadn't had, all the moments they'd let slip past unacknowledged, all the ways they'd chosen convenience over connection. "I don't love you anymore," Richard said finally. "Maybe I did once. Maybe I loved the idea of you, this brilliant, driven woman who made me feel like I was part of something important. But the actual you, the person you became, I don't think I know her well enough to love her." Eleanor felt the words settle over her, expecting pain but finding only a quiet acceptance. "I don't love you either. Not the way I should. Not the way someone deserves to be loved." So where does that leave us? Getting divorced, moving on, trying to figure out who we are separately, since we clearly lost that along the way. Eleanor finished her whiskey. "I'm not going to fight you on this, Richard. I'm not going to make it ugly or expensive or vindictive. We both made mistakes. We both failed each other. Let's at least end this with some dignity." Richard looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You've changed. Since last night, something's different. A waiter risked his job to tell me the truth about my marriage, and his 8-year-old daughter taught me about apologies. and I spent the afternoon trying to repair damage I caused 3 years ago. Eleanor moved toward the door. So yes, I've changed. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing clearly. Eleanor, Richard's voice stopped her. For what it's worth, I am sorry about the affair, about the way I handled this. You deserved better. So did you. So did Maya. So did everyone we hurt while we were too busy protecting ourselves to notice anyone else. Eleanor looked back at him one last time. Goodbye, Richard. I hope you find what you're looking for. She walked out without waiting for a response. The elevator ride down felt like descending from a great height, her ears popping as she returned to ground level. But when the doors opened and she stepped into the lobby, she didn't feel the crushing weight she'd expected. Instead, she felt something lighter. Not happy exactly, but unburdened, like putting down luggage she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was heavy. Outside, the evening was settling over the city, the October air crisp and clean. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, watching taxis flow past, people hurrying toward their own lives and dramas and private struggles. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Lucas's number. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Cross? Eleanor, please call me Eleanor. She heard Sophie chattering in the background, something about butterfly wings. I wanted to thank you again, for everything. You changed my life last night. I just told you the truth. That's not exactly heroic. It is when everyone else is too comfortable with lies. Eleanor smiled, surprising herself. And I wanted you to know, I talked to Maya today. I apologized. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. That took courage. Your daughter would say it just took honesty. Eleanor heard the smile in her own voice. She's remarkable, Lucas. You've done something really special with her. Thank you. That means a lot. He paused. Are you okay? You sound different. My husband and I are getting divorced. I'm probably going to lose half my company in the settlement. My perfect life is falling apart in real time. Eleanor looked up at the penthouse windows, glowing gold in the evening light. But honestly, I think I might be okay. Eventually. Eventually is a good place to start. They talked for a few more minutes. Small talk, really, nothing profound. But Eleanor found herself smiling anyway, enjoying the simple pleasure of a conversation that demanded nothing, promised nothing, just existed in the moment. When they finally said goodbye, she stood holding her phone, feeling oddly content. Her assistant called, Eleanor, where are you? There are 17 messages that need your attention. The investors are threatening to walk. The board wants an emergency meeting. Handle it, Eleanor said calmly. You're more than capable. But I'm taking some time, real time, to figure out what actually matters. Eleanor started walking, not sure where she was going, but knowing she needed to move. The company will survive. They always do. Tell the board I'll be back when I'm ready, and if they can't accept that, they can vote me out. She hung up before her assistant could respond. Around her, the city continued its eternal rhythm, people coming and going, lives intersecting and diverging, the constant flow of human drama. She thought about her mother's warning all those years ago. Money isn't everything. Don't forget that when you're chasing it. She'd forgotten. For 23 years, she'd forgotten. But maybe it wasn't too late to remember. Maybe there was still time to build something real, something that mattered beyond bank accounts and property portfolios and the hollow accumulation of success. Eleanor walked through the evening streets, destination unknown, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt present. Actually present. Not planning the next move or calculating the next advantage, just existing in the moment, paying attention to the world around her. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was the beginning of whatever came next. Eleanor walked until her feet ached, until the business district gave way to residential neighborhoods she'd never bothered to explore, until the familiar landmarks of her controlled life disappeared behind her. She found herself in front of a small community center, its brick facade weathered but welcoming, light spilling from windows onto the darkening street. A sign by the door advertised evening classes, pottery, painting, yoga for beginners. She stood there for a long moment, watching people filter in and out. A woman in her 60s carrying a yoga mat. 2 teenagers laughing about something on their phones. An older man with paint-stained hands. Normal people living normal lives, finding joy in simple pursuits that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market dominance. When was the last time she'd done something just because it interested her? When was the last time she'd created something that wasn't designed to generate revenue? The question had no answer. She'd spent 2 decades treating life like a business plan, every decision calculated for maximum return. Even her hobbies, the art collection, the wine cellar, the membership at the exclusive club, were really just investments in her own image, status markers rather than genuine pleasures. Eleanor's phone buzzed incessantly. She silenced it without looking. Whatever crisis her company was facing could wait. For the first time in 23 years, something mattered more than business. She walked home slowly, the October night growing colder around her. The penthouse felt different when she entered, emptier somehow, despite nothing having changed physically. Richard's presence had never filled much space, but his absence created a void that went beyond one person. It was the absence of possibility, of the marriage they might have had if either of them had tried harder, paid more attention, chosen connection over convenience. Eleanor changed into comfortable clothes, sweatpants and an old college t-shirt she'd forgotten she owned. She made tea in the kitchen that Richard's Michelin-starred chef friend had designed, sitting at the marble island that cost more than most people's cars, and realized she'd never actually cooked a meal here. They had staff for that. They had staff for everything, actually. Insulation from the ordinary tasks that constituted daily life. She thought about Lucas making breakfast for Sophie, probably in a kitchen a fraction of this size. She thought about the easy intimacy between them, the way Sophie had looked up at her father with complete trust. That kind of connection couldn't be purchased. It had to be built, day by day, through presence and attention and the accumulation of small shared moments. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked. A text from Maya. "I called the first number you gave me. They want to meet tomorrow. I don't know what you said, but thank you." Eleanor felt something warm spreading through her chest. Not quite redemption, she didn't deserve that yet, but the beginning of repair. A small action that might eventually grow into something meaningful. She typed back, "You earned this yourself. I just opened a door you should have been able to walk through 3 years ago. Good luck tomorrow." Maya's response came quickly. "I'm still angry at you, but I'm also grateful. Is it possible to feel both?" "Yes," Eleanor wrote. "I think that's called being human." She set down her phone and stared at her tea, watching steam curl into the air. The silence of the penthouse pressed against her, no longer comfortable but not yet unbearable. Just present, real. A reminder that she was alone now, probably for the first time since college. No husband, no marriage, no carefully constructed partnership to hide behind. The board meeting her assistant mentioned would be brutal. Taking unannounced time off, refusing to respond to investor concerns. These were cardinal sins in her world. She'd built her reputation on reliability, on always being available, on treating the company like it was the only thing that mattered. Because it had been. For 2 decades, it had been everything. But sitting in her expensive kitchen, drinking tea that had grown lukewarm while she wasn't paying attention, Eleanor realized something fundamental had shifted. The company wasn't everything anymore. It was important, certainly. It was her creation, her legacy, the tangible proof of her journey from poverty to power. But it wasn't the sum total of her worth as a human being. She thought about her mother, dead now for 5 years. They'd grown distant as Eleanor's success had grown, not from any explicit conflict, but from the simple fact that their lives no longer intersected meaningfully. Her mother had lived in a modest house Eleanor bought her, surrounded by simple comforts, and every visit had felt like Eleanor was touring a museum of her own past. She'd been kind, generous with money, but emotionally absent, visiting out of obligation rather than genuine connection. At her mother's funeral, an old neighbor had approached Eleanor with tears in her eyes. "Your mother was so proud of you," the woman had said, "but she always worried you were lonely. She said you'd built such a big life, but she wasn't sure anyone was living in it with you." Eleanor had dismissed the comment at the time, chalking it up to a mother's inevitable concern. But now, 5 years later, and newly alone in her perfect penthouse, she understood what her mother had seen. The emptiness at the center of all her accumulation, the way success could become its own kind of prison. The next morning arrived with brutal clarity. Eleanor woke early, not from any alarm but from the simple fact that her body had forgotten how to sleep past dawn. She dressed carefully. Not in her usual armor, but in something softer, more approachable. A cream-colored sweater, well-tailored pants, minimal jewelry. The costume of someone who had nothing to prove. The office felt foreign when she arrived. Her assistant's expression cycled through relief, concern, and barely concealed panic. Eleanor, thank God. The board has been... I know. Schedule the emergency meeting for this afternoon. I'll address their concerns then. Eleanor moved past her toward her office, then paused. What's your name? Your full name, I mean. Her assistant blinked, clearly thrown by the question. Jennifer. Jennifer Martinez. I've worked for you for 4 years. I know, and you've been excellent, but I realized yesterday that I've never asked you anything about your actual life. Do you have family, hobbies, dreams that don't involve managing my calendar? Jennifer's confusion deepened. Yes, I have a husband, 2 kids. I paint in my spare time when I have any. Why are you asking? Because I've been a terrible employer. Efficient, yes. Fair with compensation, certainly. But I've treated you like a function rather than a person. Eleanor met her eyes directly. I'm sorry for that. And I'd like to do better if you're willing to give me the chance. Mrs. Cross, are you feeling okay? Eleanor laughed, surprising them both. Honestly, no. Everything is falling apart. My marriage is ending. My board probably wants my head. I'm questioning every decision I've made for the past 20 years. But I think I might finally be seeing clearly. Jennifer studied her for a long moment. I have a daughter. She's 7. She draws these elaborate pictures of our family, and she always includes you in them because she knows I work for you. But she draws you standing apart from everyone else. Alone. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I told myself it was just a kid's perspective, but maybe she saw something I'd stopped noticing. The observation landed with unexpected weight. Eleanor thought about Sophie and her coloring book, the way children saw truth that adults learned to ignore. What would you do if you were me? I don't know if I should... Please, I'm asking genuinely. Jennifer took a breath. I'd remember that companies survive leadership changes, but relationships don't recover from years of neglect. I'd stop treating every human interaction like a transaction, and I'd figure out what actually makes me happy, not what looks impressive from the outside. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's very wise advice. Thank you. She spent the morning reviewing files, not with her usual laser focus, but with half her attention elsewhere. Thinking about Maya's interview, about Richard packing his belongings, about Lucas preparing for another shift at Marchand. The machinery of her empire hummed around her, assistants fielding calls, analysts preparing reports, the constant flow of information and decisions that kept cross-development running. She'd built this. Every system, every protocol, every carefully optimized process. It was impressive, it was efficient, and it was completely hollow. At noon, Maya texted, "The interview went well, they want to bring me back for a second round. I think this might actually happen." Eleanor smiled at her phone. Of course it will. You're talented. You always were. Why are you doing this? Really? Eleanor considered the question. Why was she doing this? Guilt, certainly. A desire to repair damage she'd caused. But also something else. A growing understanding that her life had been defined by taking, accumulating, conquering. Maybe repair was the beginning of learning to give, to build up rather than tear down. Because I'm trying to learn how to see people again, she typed back. And that starts with acknowledging the ones I stopped seeing. Maya didn't respond immediately. When she did, her message was simple. Thank you. The board meeting began at 2. Eleanor walked into the conference room to find 12 faces arranged around the table, their expressions ranging from concern to openly hostile. These were people she'd handpicked, directors whose expertise she respected, colleagues who'd helped build cross-development into what it was. And now they were looking at her like she'd lost her mind. Thomas Chen, her CFO and oldest ally, spoke first. Eleanor, we're glad you're here. We've been fielding some difficult questions from investors about your sudden absence. They're concerned about stability, about leadership continuity. I understand their concerns. Eleanor took her seat at the head of the table, maintaining eye contact with each board member in turn. And I owe all of you an explanation. I took unscheduled time yesterday because I needed to address some personal matters that couldn't wait. Personal matters? Sarah Kim, the director of operations, leaned forward. Eleanor, you've never let personal matters interfere with business. What's changed? Everything. Eleanor kept her voice steady. My marriage is ending. I've had to confront some difficult truths about how I've conducted myself, both professionally and personally. And I've realized that the way I've been running this company, the way I've been running my life, isn't sustainable. The silence around the table was profound. Thomas recovered first. Eleanor, we understand you're going through a difficult time, but the investors need reassurance. They need to know you're still committed, still capable of. I am committed, but not the way I was before. Eleanor pulled out the folder she'd spent the morning preparing. I'm proposing a restructuring of my role. I want to step back from day-to-day operations and move into more of an advisory position. Thomas, you'd take over as CEO. Sarah, you'd move up to COO. We'd bring in some new leadership, fresh perspectives. The board erupted. Voices overlapped, concerns tumbling out faster than she could track them. Eleanor waited for the initial shock to subside, then raised her hand for quiet. I know this is unexpected. I know it seems like I'm abandoning ship, but that's not what this is. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. I built this company by sacrificing everything else in my life. My marriage, my friendships, any sense of balance or perspective. And yes, it made us successful. It made us profitable. But it also made me into someone I don't particularly like. Someone who treats people as resources rather than human beings. Eleanor, Thomas started, but she continued, I fired an intern 3 years ago for a minor mistake. I didn't just terminate her employment. I blacklisted her across the industry. I destroyed her career because she embarrassed me in front of investors. Eleanor's voice remained steady, though the confession cost her. That woman is rebuilding her life now, but only because I spent yesterday trying to repair the damage I caused. And I realized something. If I can be that cruel casually, without even remembering it years later, then I've become exactly the kind of person I used to despise. The room was silent. Sarah was the first to speak. What are you saying? That you want to step down because you feel guilty? No. I want to step down because I need to figure out who I am when I'm not defined solely by this company, and because this place deserves leadership that can be fully present, not someone going through an existential crisis. Eleanor pushed the folder to the center of the table. The transition plan is in here. It's comprehensive. It protects the company's interests and ensures continuity. All I'm asking is that you consider it. Thomas opened the folder, scanning the contents. His expression shifted from concern to thoughtful. This is actually well thought out. The timeline makes sense. The succession structure is solid. I spent all morning on it. It's what I'm good at: systems, structure, planning. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. I'm not abandoning the company. I'm just trying to create space for something other than work in my life. The discussion continued for another hour. Questions and concerns raised and addressed, fears articulated and examined. Eleanor fielded them all with the calm competence that had built her reputation. But something had changed. She wasn't performing authority anymore. She was simply being honest about her limitations, her needs, her recognition that success without humanity was just sophisticated emptiness. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair. I think we need time to process this. But Eleanor, for what it's worth, I think this might be the bravest thing you've done. And I've watched you close billion-dollar deals without flinching. It doesn't feel brave. It feels terrifying. Eleanor gathered her materials, but I think that's how I know it's necessary. She left the meeting without waiting for a formal vote. They would decide what they decided, and if they voted her out entirely, if they decided she was a liability rather than an asset, she would accept it. Because for the first time in decades, she understood that her identity existed beyond her job title. Outside the conference room, Jennifer was waiting with another stack of messages. Eleanor waved them away. Tomorrow. Everything can wait until tomorrow. Eleanor? Jennifer's voice stopped her. That thing you said this morning about wanting to do better? My daughter has a school art show next week. I've always worked through it because I thought that's what you expected. But if you meant what you said, go. Of course go. Be there for your daughter. Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest. And Jennifer, from now on, when your kids need you, you leave. No explanation required, no guilt. Just go. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Eleanor walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air. She pulled out her phone and called Lucas. He answered on the third ring, slightly breathless. Eleanor? Is everything okay? I don't know yet, but I wanted to ask you something. She watched traffic flow past, the ordinary rhythm of the city. Would you and Sophie like to have dinner with me? Nothing fancy. Just dinner, maybe pizza or something normal people eat. Lucas laughed, genuine and warm. Normal people definitely eat pizza, and yes, we'd like that. When? Tonight? If you're free? Let me check with Sophie. She heard muffled conversation, Sophie's excited voice in the background. She says yes, but only if there's pepperoni. Apparently that's non-negotiable. Pepperoni it is. There's a place near my building, Joe's Pizza. Do you know it? Everyone knows Joe's. 6 o'clock? Perfect. And Lucas? Thank you. For everything. You keep thanking me for just being honest. That says something, doesn't it? Eleanor ended the call and stood on the sidewalk, commuters flowing around her like water around a stone. He was right. The fact that simple honesty seemed remarkable said everything about the world she'd built. A world where truth was rationed, where vulnerability was weakness, where human connection was secondary to strategic advantage. She spent the rest of the afternoon walking, not aimlessly now, but with purpose. She stopped at a bookstore and bought 3 novels, fiction, not business books, stories that existed simply to tell truths about human experience. She sat in a cafe and read for an hour, ordering a second coffee, not because she needed the caffeine, but because she wanted to linger in the space, watching people live their lives. At 5:30, she changed in the penthouse. Jeans and a simple blouse, casual in a way she never allowed herself in public. She studied her reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. Without the armor of expensive suits and carefully cultivated authority, she looked younger, softer, more uncertain, but also more human. Joe's Pizza was crowded when she arrived, the kind of neighborhood place where families gathered and teenagers hung out after school, and the smell of baking dough created its own kind of welcome. Lucas and Sophie were already there, sitting in a booth near the window. Sophie saw her first and waved enthusiastically. Eleanor, we saved you a seat. Eleanor slid into the booth across from them, feeling absurdly nervous. Hi. Thank you for coming. Are you kidding? Sophie's been talking about this all afternoon. Lucas smiled, and Eleanor noticed the tiredness had faded slightly from his eyes. She informed me that we're having a business meeting to discuss important matters. Sophie nodded seriously. Very important matters, like whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Absolutely not, Eleanor said without thinking, then caught herself. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? I think it's weird, but Dad likes it, so I'm trying to keep an open mind. Sophie pulled out her coloring book and a fresh page, this one depicting an elaborate garden. Do you want to color with me while we wait? Eleanor looked at the offered crayon, purple, and felt something shift in her chest. When was the last time someone had invited her to simply play? I'd love to, but I should warn you, I'm terrible at staying inside the lines. That's okay. Dad says the best art happens when you're not too worried about rules. They ordered a large pizza, half pepperoni, and half everything, nothing for Lucas's pineapple, because Sophie had declared it required further investigation. While they waited, Eleanor colored awkwardly, her lines crooked and uneven next to Sophie's careful precision. But the little girl didn't criticize. She just kept working on her own section, occasionally offering color suggestions or pointing out interesting details in the illustration. Lucas watched them with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Warmth, certainly, but also something like recognition, as if he was seeing something he'd hoped might be there. Can I ask you something? Sophie said suddenly, not looking up from her coloring. Why were you so sad the other day? Did someone die? Sophie, Lucas started, but Eleanor raised her hand gently. It's okay. She deserves an honest answer. Eleanor set down her crayon, choosing her words carefully. No one died, but I realized that I'd stopped really living. I'd been so busy working and trying to be successful that I forgot about the parts of life that actually matter, like having dinner with friends, or coloring pictures, or just paying attention to other people. Sophie considered this gravely. That sounds lonely. It was. Very lonely. But I'm trying to change that now. Good. Sophie returned to her coloring. Everyone needs friends, even sad grown-ups. Lucas caught Eleanor's eye across the table, and they shared a smile. The kind of smile that acknowledged how children could cut through complexity with devastating simplicity. The pizza arrived, steaming and perfect. They ate and talked about nothing important. Sophie's upcoming school play where she was playing a butterfly. Lucas's plans to take Sophie to the Science Museum on his next day off. Eleanor found herself sharing a story about her mother, about learning to bake bread together when Eleanor was Sophie's age, the way flour had gotten everywhere and they'd laughed until they couldn't breathe. I haven't thought about that in years, Eleanor said, surprised by her own memory. We made such a mess. The kitchen looked like it had snowed. Did the bread taste good? Sophie asked. It was terrible, dense and heavy, and we burned the bottom, but it was the best afternoon I can remember from that whole year. Because you made it together, Sophie said wisely. Things taste better when you make them with people you love. Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This child, this remarkable, perceptive child, kept finding the essential truth in everything. Sophie was right. The bread had been terrible, but the memory was precious because of the connection, the presence, the shared laughter that had nothing to do with producing a perfect result. After dinner, they walked through the neighborhood together. Sophie skipped ahead, pointing out interesting things. A dog wearing a sweater, a particularly elaborate Halloween decoration, a tree whose leaves had turned a spectacular shade of gold. Lucas walked beside Eleanor, comfortable with silence. Thank you for this, Eleanor said quietly. I know it probably seems strange, a billionaire wanting to hang out with a waiter and his daughter, but this feels more real than anything else in my life right now. It doesn't seem strange. It seems human. Lucas glanced at Sophie, making sure she wasn't too far ahead. Can I give you some advice from someone who's been where you are? Please. Don't try to fix everything at once. Don't try to become a completely different person overnight. Just practice being present. Start small. Notice one thing, one person, one moment that you would normally let pass without attention, and build from there. Eleanor nodded, filing the advice away. Is that what you did after your wife left? Eventually, after I'd spent months trying to simultaneously fix everything and punish myself for failing, Lucas's voice was gentle, without self-pity. But Sophie saved me, because I couldn't fall apart completely. She needed breakfast and help with homework and someone to read her bedtime stories. Those small daily acts of presence, they pulled me back to life. You're a good father. I'm trying. That's all any of us can do, really. Just try. And forgive ourselves when we fall short. They walked Sophie back to Lucas's building, a modest 6-story walk-up in a neighborhood Eleanor rarely visited. Sophie hugged Eleanor goodbye with unselfconscious affection. Can we do this again? Sophie asked. I like having dinner with you. I'd like that too, Eleanor said, and meant it completely. After Sophie went inside, Eleanor and Lucas stood on the sidewalk. The evening had grown cold, October reminding them that winter was coming. I meant what I said before, Eleanor told him, about helping if you need anything. A better job, childcare assistance, whatever you need. I appreciate that. But Eleanor, we're doing okay. We don't need rescuing. Lucas's voice was kind but firm. What we need, what everyone needs, is just to be seen, to be treated like we matter. You did that tonight. That's worth more than money. Eleanor felt the words settle into some place deep inside her. He was right. She'd spent 20 years thinking money solved everything, fixed everything, bought everything worth having. But standing on this ordinary street corner, having shared pizza with a single father and his daughter, she understood that presence was the currency that actually mattered. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing me too. She walked home alone through the cooling night, but the loneliness that had pressed against her for days felt lighter somehow. She'd taken a step. Small, uncertain, but real. She'd practiced presence, she'd allowed connection. She'd let herself be human rather than performing competence. The penthouse felt less empty when she returned, Or maybe she was just learning to inhabit it differently, to exist in the space rather than just moving through it. She made tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights below, thinking about Sophie's coloring book and Lucas's quiet wisdom and Maya's tentative forgiveness. 3 days ago, her life had looked perfect from every angle. Now it was broken, uncertain, completely unrecognizable. But somewhere in the breaking light was getting in. And Eleanor was finally learning to see it. The next 3 months unfolded with a strange rhythm, part demolition, part rebuilding, all of it uncomfortable in ways Eleanor had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. The board approved her transition plan with surprising unanimity, though Thomas had pulled her aside afterward with concern etched into his features. "Are you sure about this?" he'd asked, his hand on her shoulder with a familiarity that suggested their 20-year working relationship. "You built this company from nothing. Stepping back now, it feels like giving up." "It's not giving up. It's making space." Eleanor had squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. "Trust me, Thomas. You're ready for this. And I need to figure out who I am when I'm not the woman who built cross-development." The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency. Richard had been true to his word. No fighting, no vindictiveness, just the methodical dissolution of a partnership that had expired years before either of them had the courage to acknowledge it. They divided assets, signed papers, spoke to each other with the careful politeness of strangers who happened to share a significant portion of history. The last time Eleanor saw him was at the lawyer's office, both of them signing the final documents that would officially end their marriage. Richard had looked tired but lighter somehow, as if putting down a burden he'd been carrying too long. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he'd said as they stood in the lobby, about to walk in opposite directions for the last time. "You too. And Richard?" Eleanor had met his eyes directly. "I'm sorry for all of it. For not seeing you. For not trying harder. For letting us become strangers who happen to live in the same house." He'd nodded, something like relief crossing his face. "I'm sorry too. We both failed at this. Maybe that's the most honest thing we can say about it." They'd parted without drama, without the explosive confrontation Eleanor had half expected. Just two people acknowledging a mutual failure and choosing to move forward separately. The anticlimax of it felt appropriate somehow. Their marriage had ended not with passion, but with the slow erosion of everything that had once connected them. Maya had called her a week later, her voice bright with excitement Eleanor hadn't heard before. "I got the job, senior associate at Morrison Development. They said my presentation was one of the best they'd seen from someone with my experience level." "That's wonderful. Congratulations." "Eleanor," Maya's voice had grown quieter, more serious. "I know I said I was still angry, and I am, in ways I'm still processing, but I also need to thank you for giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever, for helping me remember why I loved this work in the first place." "You did that yourself. I just made some phone calls." "No, you did more than that. You acknowledged what you'd done. You took responsibility. Do you know how rare that is? How many people with your power would rather pretend their cruelty never happened than actually try to repair it?" Eleanor had swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I'm trying to be better. That's all. Just trying." "That's more than most people do." Maya had paused, and Eleanor could hear voices in the background, the ambient noise of an office. "I should go. But Eleanor, I hope things get better for you. I really do." The call had ended, leaving Eleanor sitting in her increasingly empty penthouse. Richard had taken his things, and she'd started donating or discarding much of what remained, stripping away the accumulated props of their shared life. The space felt cavernous now, echoing with absence. But it also felt honest. No more pretending. No more performing for an audience that had stopped watching years ago. She'd started spending more time outside the penthouse, deliberately seeking spaces where people lived actual lives. Coffee shops where she'd sit for hours with her novels, no laptop, no phone calls, just reading and watching the flow of humanity around her. The community center where she'd enrolled in a pottery class, her hands clumsy and uncertain with the clay, but the instructor patient and encouraging. A volunteer position at a literacy center, teaching adults to read, discovering that her skill at breaking down complex systems translated surprisingly well to teaching phonics. Lucas and Sophie had become part of her regular rotation. Dinner every Thursday, sometimes at Joe's Pizza, sometimes at a little Thai place Sophie loved, once at Eleanor's penthouse, where Sophie had been awed by the view and completely unimpressed by the expensive art. They'd colored together at Eleanor's kitchen island, Sophie working on her elaborate pages while Eleanor struggled with basic shapes, both of them laughing at Eleanor's crooked attempts at butterflies. "You're getting better," Sophie had announced one evening, studying Eleanor's latest effort with serious consideration. "The wings are still wonky, but you stayed inside the lines mostly." "High praise indeed," Eleanor had replied, and Lucas had smiled at them both with an expression that made Eleanor's chest feel warm and tight simultaneously. She was careful not to mistake these evenings for something they weren't. Lucas was becoming a friend, maybe her first real friend in decades, if she was honest with herself. Someone who knew her without the armor of success, who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't turned away. But she didn't push for more, didn't try to transform friendship into something complicated by romance or need. She was too raw for that, too uncertain of who she was becoming to risk projecting her loneliness onto someone else's life. Besides, watching Lucas with Sophie was its own kind of education. The way he listened when she talked about her day, actually listened, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. The way he noticed when she was tired or worried or excited, adjusting his responses to meet her where she was. The way he showed up consistently and completely, not because it advanced any agenda, but simply because love demanded presence. Eleanor had started practicing that kind of attention in her own life, really looking at Jennifer when they spoke, asking follow-up questions about her daughter's art show, remembering that her son was struggling with math and checking in about how tutoring was going, learning the names of the baristas at her regular coffee shop, the security guard in her building, the woman who cleaned her office. Not in the calculated way she'd once networked, but with genuine interest in their actual lives. It was harder than she'd expected. Decades of treating people as functions had carved deep grooves in her behavior. She caught herself constantly, about to dismiss someone, about to prioritize efficiency over connection, about to choose the path of least emotional engagement. But she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, but learning. One evening in late January, Eleanor found herself at Sophie's school play. Lucas had mentioned it casually during their Thursday dinner, and Eleanor had asked if she could attend. Sophie had been thrilled, insisting Eleanor sit in the front row next to Lucas so she could see them both when she performed. The play was exactly what you'd expect from a second-grade production. Enthusiastic chaos, missed cues, elaborate costumes that clearly represented significant parental effort, and a plot that made sense only to the 7-year-olds performing it. Sophie played a butterfly who helped a caterpillar learn to read, which involved a lot of flapping and some truly creative interpretations of phonics lessons. Eleanor watched, mesmerized not by the performance itself, but by the parents around her. The way they filmed everything on their phones, tears streaming down their faces at their children's uncertain recitations. The way they laughed and applauded and whispered encouragement. The way they were fully present for this small, imperfect moment that would never matter to anyone except the people in this room. When Sophie took her bow, she scanned the audience until she found Eleanor and Lucas, and her face split into a grin so wide and genuine it made Eleanor's throat ache. She waved enthusiastically, nearly knocking over the caterpillar in the process, and Eleanor found herself waving back with equal enthusiasm, completely unself-conscious in her pride for this child who'd somehow worked her way into Eleanor's reconstructed life. After the play, Sophie crashed into Lucas with the full-body hug of someone who'd just accomplished something momentous. "Did you see me? Did you see my wings? I didn't forget any of my lines." "You were magnificent," Lucas said, scooping her up despite her being almost too big for it. "A true artist." "Eleanor, did you like it?" Sophie turned to her with anxious hope. "I loved it. You were the best butterfly I've ever seen." Eleanor felt tears threatening and didn't bother to hide them. "Thank you for inviting me." "You're part of our family now," Sophie said matter-of-factly, as if this was simply an observable fact rather than something that made Eleanor's entire chest constrict. "That means you have to come to all my important events." Lucas caught Eleanor's eye over Sophie's head, his expression apologetic and amused and something warmer she couldn't quite name. "Sorry, Sophie has very strong opinions about family membership." I don't mind, Eleanor said quietly. I'd be honored. They went for ice cream after, the three of them plus two of Sophie's classmates and their parents, sitting at sticky tables in a shop that smelled like sugar and childhood. Eleanor found herself in conversation with another mother, talking about Sophie's performance and somehow ending up discussing the challenges of single parenthood, only realizing halfway through that the other woman thought Eleanor was Lucas's partner. Oh no, Eleanor had corrected gently. We're just friends. He's doing this alone. He's remarkable. The woman had smiled knowingly. Friends who look at each other the way you two do don't usually stay just friends. But what do I know? I've been married 15 years and still can't figure out relationships. Eleanor had let the comment pass without correction, but it lodged somewhere in her chest, uncomfortable and not entirely unwelcome. Did she look at Lucas differently? Probably. He'd fundamentally altered her understanding of what mattered, what success actually meant, what it looked like to show up for another human being without calculation or agenda. But that didn't mean she wasn't ready to. The thought remained incomplete, circling without landing. By March, the company transition was complete. Thomas had officially taken over as CEO, and Eleanor's new role as senior advisor meant she worked maybe 20 hours a week, consulting on major decisions but freed from the relentless grind of daily operations. The change had been jarring at first. She'd spent 2 decades defining herself by her availability, her tireless commitment, her willingness to sacrifice everything for the company. Learning to step back, to trust others, to accept that the empire she'd built could function without her constant oversight had required daily acts of intentional release. But the space it created was astonishing. Suddenly she had time for pottery classes and volunteer work and reading novels just for pleasure. Time for long walks through neighborhoods she'd never explored. Time to actually cook meals in her expensive kitchen, learning through trial and error how to make simple dishes that tasted nothing like restaurant food but felt more nourishing somehow. Time to remember who she'd been before success had consumed everything else. Jennifer had approached her one afternoon with an unusual request. My daughter's school has a career day coming up. They want professionals to come talk about their work. I know it's probably below your pay grade now, but would you consider it? Eleanor had agreed immediately, spending an evening preparing a presentation that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market dominance. Instead, she'd talked about failure, about the mistakes she'd made, the people she'd hurt, the years she'd spent measuring success by the wrong metrics, about learning to see people, to value presence, to understand that the most important things in life couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The 7-year-olds had stared at her with polite confusion, but several parents had approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking her for the honesty. One father had gripped her hand and said, I needed to hear that. I've been working 70-hour weeks telling myself it was for my family, but I'm missing everything that actually matters. It's not too late, Eleanor had told him. It's never too late to start showing up. She'd meant it. Because if she, Eleanor Cross, who'd spent 23 years optimizing herself into isolation, could learn to be present, anyone could. It wasn't easy. It required constant attention, constant course correction, constant willingness to choose connection over efficiency. But it was possible. In April, Maya invited her to lunch. They met at a small bistro, nothing like the exclusive restaurants where Eleanor used to conduct business. Maya looked different, more confident, more settled into herself. The hunted expression Eleanor remembered from their conversation in the park had been replaced by something steadier. I have news, Maya said as soon as they'd ordered. I'm leading a major development project. Morrison gave it to me after I pitched them an approach for sustainable mixed-use spaces that they'd never considered before. It's everything I dreamed about when I first got into this field. Maya, that's incredible. Congratulations. I couldn't have done it without you opening that door. But Eleanor... Maya leaned forward, her expression serious. I need to tell you something. About Richard. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She'd successfully avoided thinking about Richard for weeks. The divorce finalized and their lives completely separate now. What about him? We're not together anymore. We ended it about a month ago. Maya took a breath. I realized something. I'd spent 3 years wanting to hurt you the way you hurt me. And being with Richard, it accomplished that in a way. But it didn't actually make me feel better. It just made me complicit in the same kind of cruelty I'd resented in you. Eleanor absorbed this, feeling a complex mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. How is he? Honestly, I think he's relieved. We were never really together in any meaningful way. We were both using each other, him to escape a hollow marriage, me to feel like I had power over the woman who destroyed my career. But that's not love. That's just mutual damage. I'm sorry that you spent 3 years entangled in the mess Richard and I made. Don't be. I made my own choices. I own them. Maya smiled, something genuine and hard-earned. But I'm done with revenge. I'm done with letting what you did to me 3 years ago define who I am now. I've got my career back. I'm doing work I love, and I'm learning to build a life based on what I want, not what I'm trying to prove to someone else. Eleanor felt tears threatening again, a common occurrence these days, as if her carefully controlled emotions had finally breached whatever dam she'd constructed. You're remarkable. You know that? You could have stayed bitter. You would have been justified. But you chose something better. I learned it from watching you, these past few months, seeing you actually try to change, to be better, to acknowledge your mistakes instead of defending them. That took real courage. Maya reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand briefly. Thank you, for all of it, even the hard parts, maybe especially the hard parts. They finished lunch talking about Maya's new project, about Eleanor's pottery class disasters, about the ordinary details of rebuilding lives after catastrophic change. And when they parted, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected. Genuine friendship with someone who had every reason to hate her. The possibility of repair, even after severe damage. The hope that growth was always possible, if you were willing to do the uncomfortable work of actually changing. That evening, Eleanor found herself back at the coffee shop where she'd first met Lucas and Sophie. It had become one of her regular spots, comfortable, unpretentious, filled with the ambient noise of people living their lives. She was reading and drinking terrible coffee when Lucas slid into the seat across from her, Sophie in tow with her ever-present coloring book. "We saw you through the window," Lucas said by way of greeting. "Sophie insisted we come say hi. I wanted to show you my new book." Sophie was already opening it to a page depicting an elaborate forest scene. "It has unicorns and dragons. Very complicated." Eleanor smiled, closing her novel. "That sounds extremely complicated. Can I color with you?" They fell into the easy rhythm they'd developed over months of these encounters. Sophie narrated her artistic choices. Why this tree needed to be purple. Why the dragon should have 3 heads. Why unicorns were scientifically plausible despite what certain people thought. Lucas and Eleanor colored alongside her, their efforts clumsy compared to Sophie's careful work, but welcomed nonetheless. "I have something to tell you," Lucas said after a while, not looking up from the blue scales he was adding to the dragon. "I got a promotion. Manager position at Marchand. Better pay, better hours, more stability for Sophie." "Lucas, that's wonderful." Eleanor felt genuine delight spreading through her chest. "You deserve it. You've worked so hard." "I'm not going to pretend your recommendation didn't help. The owner mentioned you'd called, said some very generous things about my character and work ethic." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "So thank you. For that, and for everything else." "I didn't exaggerate. I told them the truth, that you're one of the most principled people I've ever met." Eleanor set down her crayon. "You changed my life, Lucas, you and Sophie both. You taught me what presence actually looks like. We're just living our lives. You did all the hard work of actually changing." "Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without seeing what it looked like to show up for someone completely, without agenda, without calculation." Eleanor glanced at Sophie, who was deeply absorbed in adding details to a unicorn's mane. "You're a remarkable father and a remarkable person." "Dad's the best," Sophie announced without looking up. "Everyone knows that." They all laughed, the sound easy and genuine. Eleanor felt something settling in her chest. Not quite contentment, not quite peace, but something like acceptance. This was her life now. Not the empire, not the status, not the relentless accumulation of success. Just these quiet moments of connection, these small acts of presence, these choices to see and be seen. "Eleanor?" Sophie set down her crayon and looked at her with those serious eyes that always seemed to see too much. Are you still sad? Eleanor considered the question honestly. Was she still sad? The divorce was final. Her marriage was over. Her role at the company had fundamentally changed. Everything that had defined her for 2 decades was gone or transformed beyond recognition. By any objective measure, she should be devastated. I'm not sad anymore, she said slowly, discovering the truth of it as she spoke. I'm different. I'm uncertain about a lot of things, but I'm not sad. Good. Sophie returned to her coloring. Because you smile more now. I like it when you smile. The simple observation landed with unexpected weight. Eleanor tried to remember the last time someone had commented on her smile, had noticed something about her emotional state that wasn't directly tied to business or productivity. Her mother, maybe, years before she died. No one since then. She'd trained everyone around her to focus on her competence, her efficiency, her results. The cost of that training was being invisible as a human being. They colored until Sophie grew tired, her careful lines becoming looser, her commentary winding down to occasional observations. Lucas finally announced it was bedtime, prompting the expected protest that was undermined by Sophie's obvious exhaustion. Walk us home? Lucas asked Eleanor. It's on your way. It wasn't, not really, but Eleanor agreed anyway. They walked through the cool April evening, Sophie between them holding both their hands, chattering about tomorrow's plans, a trip to the library, maybe the park if the weather held, definitely ice cream because it was Friday, and Friday meant treats. Eleanor listened, absorbing the ordinary beauty of it all, the mundane logistics of single parenthood, the small rewards and manageable challenges. The life built not on grand achievements, but on daily acts of care and attention. This was what she'd been missing, not the big moments, the dramatic successes, the milestone accomplishments, but this, the simple presence, the showing up, the being fully engaged with another person's small joys and concerns. At Lucas's building, Sophie hugged Eleanor goodnight with her customary enthusiasm. See you next Thursday? Absolutely. It's the best part of my week. Sophie beamed and disappeared inside, leaving Lucas and Eleanor on the sidewalk. The evening had grown cooler, city sounds muted in this residential neighborhood. Lucas studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Of course. What are you looking for in this new life you're building? Eleanor thought about the question, watching streetlights flicker on as darkness settled over the city. I'm not sure I'm looking for anything specific. I'm just trying to be present, to notice things I used to miss, to build connections instead of conquests. She paused, then continued with careful honesty. And I'm trying to forgive myself for all the years I spent measuring my worth by metrics that didn't actually matter. Lucas nodded slowly. That's good work. Important work. He hesitated, then continued. For what it's worth, I think you're doing remarkably well. I see the effort you put into being present with Sophie, with me, with everyone. I see you choosing connection even when it's uncomfortable. That's not easy for anyone, but especially not for someone who spent decades training themselves to prioritize everything else. Thank you. That means more than you know. Eleanor felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes. Lucas, I need you to understand something. You and Sophie, you've given me something I didn't know I needed. Not a relationship, not some romantic solution to my loneliness, but a model for what actually matters. You've shown me what presence looks like in practice, not just theory. We've just been ourselves. Honestly, Eleanor, you give us way too much credit. No, I give you exactly the right amount. Eleanor smiled, surprising herself with its genuineness. But I also want you to know I'm not trying to insert myself into your life in ways that don't make sense. I'm not trying to replace Sophie's mother or become something more complicated than a friend. I'm just grateful for your patience, for your willingness to let me stumble through learning how to be human again. Lucas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You know what Sophie said to me the other night? She said having you in our lives makes everything feel more complete. Not because we needed fixing, but because you see us, really see us. And being seen, that's a gift most people don't even realize they're not giving. The words settled over Eleanor like a blessing. She'd spent 23 years demanding to be seen while refusing to see anyone else. The irony wasn't lost on her, but here, standing on this ordinary street corner with a man who'd risked everything to tell her a truth she needed to hear, she understood that seeing and being seen were reciprocal. You couldn't have one without offering the other. "I should go," she said finally. "But Lucas, thank you for everything. Same time next Thursday? I'll be there." Eleanor walked back toward her building, taking the long route, in no hurry to return to the penthouse that was slowly transforming from a showpiece into something that might eventually feel like home. She thought about Sophie's question, "Are you still sad?" and her own answer. She wasn't sad. She was uncertain, yes. Changed, absolutely. Still figuring out who she was when she wasn't defined by her company or her marriage or her relentless drive for success. But not sad. The community center was still lit when she passed it, people filtering out from evening classes. On impulse, Eleanor stopped and read the schedule posted by the door. Pottery on Tuesdays, yoga on Thursdays, a book club that met every other Wednesday, volunteer opportunities at the neighborhood food bank, small ways to connect, to contribute, to exist in community rather than isolation. She pulled out her phone and signed up for the book club, then feeling bold added her name to the volunteer list for the food bank. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Movement towards something that felt more real than anything she'd built in the previous 2 decades. Her phone buzzed. "Maya, I forgot to tell you at lunch. I'm working with a young architect on my new project. 23 years old, just out of grad school, so eager to prove herself. And I find myself being patient with her mistakes, encouraging her through challenges, remembering what it felt like to be that young and uncertain. You did that. You showed me what repair looks like. I'm paying it forward." Eleanor read the message 3 times, feeling something warm and solid settling in her chest. This was what real success looked like. Not the empire she'd built, not the wealth she'd accumulated, not the deals she'd closed or the competitors she'd crushed, but this, the ripple effect of choosing repair over revenge, of modeling change instead of defending mistakes, of showing that growth was always possible if you were willing to do the uncomfortable work. She typed back, "Thank you for telling me. And thank you for being the kind of person who chooses to build up rather than tear down. You're going to change someone's life the way Lucas changed mine." At the penthouse, Eleanor made tea and settled by the window, watching the city lights below. She thought about the note that had changed everything. Lucas's careful handwriting on a torn piece of paper, words that had cracked her perfect world open and revealed the emptiness underneath. At the time, it had felt like destruction. Now, months later, she understood it had been the beginning of reconstruction. Her phone rang. Thomas, calling late as he often did now, juggling the demands of CEO while trying to maintain some semblance of personal life. "Eleanor? Sorry to bother you. I need advice on the Mitchell acquisition. There's an opportunity to undercut a competitor, but it would mean laying off about 50 employees from their company. Numbers-wise, it makes sense, but they're people, not numbers," Eleanor finished. "And firing 50 people to boost quarterly profits isn't worth the human cost." "That's what I thought, but I wanted to check with you, make sure I wasn't being too soft." Eleanor smiled. "Thomas, there's no such thing as too soft when you're dealing with people's livelihoods. Find another way. There's always another way if you're willing to prioritize humanity over efficiency." "Thanks. That's what I needed to hear." He paused. "You sound different these days. Happier, maybe, or at least more at peace." "I'm working on it. It's a daily practice, not a destination. But yes, I think I'm finding my way to something that feels more real." After the call ended, Eleanor sat with her tea, thinking about the conversation. A year ago, she would have told Thomas to make the acquisition regardless of the human cost. Efficiency above all. Results over relationships. The calculus that had built her empire and hollowed out her life. But she wasn't that person anymore. She was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with frequent backsliding, to prioritize presence over profit, connection over conquest, repair over ruthlessness. It was harder than her old approach. It required constant attention, constant choice, constant willingness to do the more difficult thing. But it was also real in ways her previous life had never been. The weeks slipped into months. Spring bloomed across the city, trees leafing out in brilliant green, flowers pushing up through sidewalk cracks, the air warming and softening. Eleanor found her rhythms changing with the seasons. Morning walks before her reduced work schedule. Afternoon pottery classes where her misshapen bowls gradually became slightly less misshapen. Evenings at the literacy center, watching adult students sound out words with the same concentration Sophie applied to her coloring books. And Thursdays with Lucas and Sophie, the anchor point of her week, the reminder of what actual connection looked like. They explored the city together, finding parks and museums and small restaurants Sophie declared had the best grilled cheese or the most interesting ceiling. Eleanor learned to be present for these excursions, to put away her phone, to exist fully in whatever moment they were sharing. Sophie's 8th birthday arrived in May. Eleanor had asked Lucas what Sophie might like, and he'd suggested art supplies. The good ones, not the cheap kid versions. Eleanor had gone to a professional art store and bought everything. Quality colored pencils, sketchbooks with thick paper, watercolor sets, brushes in every size. She'd wrapped each item separately, creating a mountain of presents that made Sophie's eyes go wide with disbelief. "This is too much," Lucas had protested quietly while Sophie tore into the packages with 8-year-old enthusiasm. "It's exactly right," Eleanor had replied. "Let me do this, please." She deserves to have tools that match her talent. The birthday party was small. Sophie, Lucas, 3 of Sophie's friends, and Eleanor. They'd gathered in the small park near Lucas's apartment, eating grocery store cake that was too sweet and playing games that had rules only the 8-year-olds understood. Eleanor had found herself in an intense discussion about whether unicorns could swim, defending the position that they could, obviously, against a boy who insisted their horns would weigh them down. At one point, Lucas had caught her eye across the picnic table and mouthed, "Thank you." Not just for the gifts, Eleanor understood, but for showing up, for being present, for treating Sophie's 8th birthday like it was the most important event of the season. Because for Sophie, it was. And Eleanor was learning that the most important moments were often the smallest ones, the ones that would never make headlines or boost quarterly earnings, but would be remembered with love for years to come. As summer approached, Eleanor made a decision. The penthouse had to go. It was too big, too expensive, too laden with memories of a life she no longer wanted to inhabit. She called a realtor and listed it, then began looking for something smaller, more human-scaled. Not poverty, not some performative rejection of wealth, but a space that invited actual living rather than just showcasing success. She found a townhouse in a neighborhood she'd never considered. Not trendy, not prestigious, just solid and real. 3 stories, a small garden, windows that let in actual sunlight. It was a fraction of the size of the penthouse and cost considerably less, which was fine because she was learning that square footage didn't correlate with happiness. The day she moved in, Lucas and Sophie helped her unpack boxes. Sophie had declared herself in charge of deciding where things went, making pronouncements about which room needed, which piece of furniture based on logic only she could follow. Eleanor had submitted to her authority with amusement, watching this small person rearrange her life with confident certainty. "You need plants," Sophie had announced, surveying the living room critically. "Places feel lonely without plants." So they'd gone to a nursery together, Eleanor, Lucas, and Sophie, and bought more plants than any reasonable person needed. Sophie picked each one personally, explaining why this fern would be happy by the window and that succulent needed to live on the bookshelf. Back at the townhouse, they'd arranged the plants according to Sophie's vision, creating a small indoor garden that made the space feel immediately more alive. "Better," Sophie had declared with satisfaction. "Now it's a home." Eleanor had looked around at her new space. Smaller, simpler, filled with plants chosen by an 8-year-old and boxes she was unpacking with the help of friends. And she'd felt something she hadn't experienced in her pristine penthouse: belonging. This was hers, not because she'd bought it or because it impressed anyone, but because she was actually inhabiting it, living in it rather than just storing her possessions there. That evening, after Sophie had gone home exhausted and happy, Lucas had stayed to help Eleanor finish the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, unwrapping dishes and finding homes for them in cabinets that smelled like fresh wood. "Can I tell you something?" Lucas said finally, placing a stack of plates on a shelf. "Always. When I first told you about the affair, I thought I might lose my job. I thought you'd be angry at the messenger, Blame me for telling you something you didn't want to hear. He turned to face her, leaning against the counter. But you've done something I've never seen before. You took that moment, that devastating moment, and used it as a catalyst for real change. Not just surface changes, but fundamental transformation of who you are and how you move through the world. Eleanor felt tears threatening, still a common occurrence, though she was learning not to fight them. I couldn't have done it without you. Without your courage in telling me the truth, and your patience in showing me what actual presence looks like. I didn't do anything special. I just lived my life and let you watch. That's exactly what made it special. You showed me that the most important work happens in the small moments, the daily choices, the consistent showing up for the people who matter. Eleanor moved closer, maintaining appropriate distance, but allowing vulnerability. Lucas, I need you to know you saved my life. Not in some dramatic way, but in the way that actually matters. You showed me how to start living it. Lucas was quiet, his expression unreadable. Then, carefully, he said, Sophie asked me the other night if you were going to be her mom. I told her it doesn't work that way, that relationships are complicated, that you're our friend and that's wonderful on its own. Eleanor's heart contracted. What did she say? She said that was okay, that being friends was good, but that she hopes someday you'll be more than that because she loves you. He met Eleanor's eyes directly. And I had to tell her I couldn't make promises about the future, but that I understood the feeling. Because I love you too, Eleanor, not as a project or a responsibility or someone I'm trying to save, just as the person you are now, complicated and uncertain and trying so hard to be better. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Eleanor felt them settling over her, understanding the weight of what was being offered. Not rescue, not completion, not some romantic solution to loneliness. Just partnership. The possibility of building something together based on mutual respect and genuine seeing. I love you too, she said quietly. I didn't realize it until just now, but I do. You and Sophie both, you've become... She struggled for words. You've become the center of my life in ways that have nothing to do with need or desperation. I just genuinely want to be around you. I want to hear about your days. I want to watch Sophie grow up. I want to be part of whatever you're building. Lucas smiled and it transformed his entire face. So what do we do now? I don't know. I've never done this before. Not really. Not without calculation or agenda. Not just because two people saw each other and decided they wanted to keep looking. Eleanor felt a laugh bubbling up, surprising and genuine. I have no idea how to date like a normal person. I'm 52 years old and I'm completely lost. Good. Me too. We can figure it out together. Lucas moved closer, tentatively reaching for her hand. No rush, no expectations, just seeing what happens when two people actually pay attention to each other. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of restaurant work, the strength in his grip, the simple human warmth of the contact. This was what she'd been missing. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts or the performance of romance, but this, simple touch, honest connection, the willingness to be uncertain together. They stood in her new kitchen, boxes still unpacked around them, holding hands like teenagers while the evening light faded outside. Nothing was resolved, nothing was certain, but everything was possible, and that felt like more than enough. The months that followed were nothing like Eleanor had expected. Dating Lucas wasn't a whirlwind romance or a dramatic transformation. It was quiet dinners and long conversations and learning the ordinary rhythms of someone else's life. It was negotiating boundaries with Sophie, making sure this shift in their relationship didn't confuse or overwhelm her. It was slow, careful, built on the foundation of friendship they'd already established. Sophie had been delighted, of course, immediately declaring this was what she'd wanted all along and taking full credit for the relationship. Eleanor had learned to let her have that victory, understanding that children needed to feel some control over the changes in their lives. Eleanor had also finally visited her mother's grave, something she'd avoided for years out of guilt and shame, and the uncomfortable recognition that she'd failed to be fully present even at the end. She'd brought flowers and sat on the ground beside the headstone, telling her mother about everything that had changed, about the divorce, the company transition, Lucas and Sophie, the slow process of learning to be human again. You tried to warn me, she'd said to the silent stone. About money not being everything, about building a life instead of just accumulating success. I didn't listen. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you meant. The wind had moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and earth. Eleanor had sat there for over an hour, feeling closer to her mother than she had in the last decade of her life. Sometimes absence could teach what presence hadn't managed to convey. By late fall, Eleanor had settled into her new life with surprising ease. The reduced work schedule felt natural now, rather than uncomfortable. Her pottery had improved to the point where her bowls were actually usable, which Sophie declared a major accomplishment. The literacy center had become a regular part of her week, her students making progress that felt more meaningful than any business deal she'd ever closed. And Lucas had become the person she called when something funny happened, when she needed advice, when she just wanted to hear his voice. They'd taken it slow, conscious of Sophie's needs and their own uncertainties, but they were building something real, something based on actual knowing rather than projection or need. One evening in November, almost exactly a year after the note that had changed everything, Eleanor found herself back at Marchand. Lucas had invited her to dinner, a real dinner, at the restaurant where he now worked as manager, where their story had begun in the most unexpected way. They sat at the same corner booth where Eleanor had received Lucas's note. Sophie was with Lucas's mother for the evening, giving them rare time alone. The restaurant looked the same, elegant, expensive, the kind of place where Eleanor used to conduct business over wine and strategic conversation. But she was different. Fundamentally, irrevocably different. The woman who'd sat in this booth a year ago had been hollow at her core, performing success while drowning in isolation. The woman sitting here now was uncertain about many things, still figuring out who she was apart from her achievements, still learning the grammar of genuine connection. But she was real, present, actually inhabiting her own life rather than just managing it from a distance. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, watching her with the attentive presence she'd come to rely on. "I'm thinking about the note, about how a single act of courage from a stranger completely changed my life's trajectory." Eleanor reached across the table for his hand. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you took that risk." "I was terrified," Lucas admitted. "Sophie was sleeping at my mom's that night, and I just kept thinking, what if this costs me my job? What if I can't make rent? What if trying to do the right thing destroys everything I've built? But you did it anyway, because you deserved to know. Because letting someone live in a lie just felt wrong, even if telling the truth might destroy me." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm glad I did. Not just because of us, though that's been—" He paused, searching for words. "But because watching you choose to change, to actually do the work of becoming different, that's been extraordinary. You didn't have to do any of it. You could have divorced Richard, moved on, kept your life essentially the same, but you chose transformation instead." Eleanor felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes. "I chose it because the alternative was unbearable, living that hollow life for another day, another year, another decade. I couldn't do it anymore. The note didn't just tell me about Richard's affair. It held up a mirror and showed me everything I'd become. And what do you see now, when you look in that mirror? Someone who's still learning, still making mistakes, still uncertain about so many things." Eleanor smiled, feeling the genuine warmth of it. "But also someone who shows up, who pays attention, who's learning to see people instead of just using them. That's not nothing." "That's everything," Lucas corrected gently. They ordered dinner, not the expensive wines and elaborate courses Eleanor used to choose, but simple food shared between people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They talked about everything and nothing, about Sophie's upcoming school performance where she'd be playing a tree, about Lucas's plans to eventually open his own restaurant, something small and neighborhood-focused, about Eleanor's idea for a nonprofit focused on second-chance employment, giving people like Maya opportunities to rebuild careers after setbacks. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, between the main course and dessert, Eleanor realized something profound. She was happy. Not the performed happiness of her previous life, not the hollow satisfaction of closing a deal or the temporary pleasure of expensive things, but actual, genuine happiness, the kind that came from being fully present, from connecting authentically, from building a life based on values that actually mattered. I love you, she said suddenly, interrupting Lucas mid-sentence about Sophie's obsession with dinosaurs. I know I've said it before, but I need you to understand. I love you without agenda. I love you without needing you to complete me, or fix me, or validate my worth. I just love you for exactly who you are, for showing me what presence looks like, for having the courage to tell me a truth that changed my life. Lucas was quiet, his eyes bright with emotion. I love you too. And Eleanor, you saved yourself. I just held up a mirror. They left Marchand hand in hand, walking through November streets that smelled like fallen leaves and approaching winter. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, so certain, so controlled, so completely lost without realizing it. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Eleanor barely recognized. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required daily choices, constant vigilance, endless willingness to choose differently than she'd been trained to choose. But standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant where everything had changed, holding the hand of a man who'd risked everything to tell her the truth, Eleanor understood that some kinds of destruction were necessary. Some things needed to break before they could be rebuilt stronger, more honest, more real. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. Are you having fun on your date? Dad said I couldn't call, but I could text. I hope you're holding hands because that's what people in love do. Eleanor showed the text to Lucas and they both laughed. The easy, genuine laughter of people who'd found something rare and were determined to protect it. Should we head home, Lucas asked. My mom's probably ready to hand Sophie back. Let's walk, Eleanor suggested. I'm in no hurry. Let's just be present for this moment. So they walked through the city Eleanor had once conquered, now experiencing it not as territory to control, but as a place to exist within. They stopped to watch street performers, bought hot chocolate from a vendor, sat on a bench watching people pass, each one carrying their own private dramas and small joys. And Eleanor, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, felt completely present. Not planning the next move, not calculating advantage, not performing for an invisible audience. Just existing in the moment, paying attention, allowing uncertainty, being fully human in all its messy, imperfect, beautiful complexity. The note had broken her perfect world open, but in the breaking, she'd finally learned to see, not just to look, but to actually see. To notice people instead of using them, to value presence over profit, to understand that the most important work happened not in boardrooms, but in small moments of genuine connection. She was still learning. She would probably always be learning. But learning was better than the false certainty she'd clung to for decades. Learning meant growth was possible. Learning meant transformation was always within reach if you were brave enough to admit you needed to change. As winter settled over the city and the year drew to a close, Eleanor Cross, former billionaire empress, recovering workaholic, student of presence, held the hand of a restaurant manager and his 8-year-old daughter and felt something she'd been seeking her entire life without knowing how to name it. She felt seen. She felt present. She felt human. And that, she finally understood, was the only success that actually mattered.